The gown would not stop shaking, and neither would the hands inside it. Elira stood behind a curtain of heavy velvet, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought the guards outside might hear it. Someone had laced her into a dress worth more than her entire life's wages, and someone else was pinning her hair with trembling fingers, muttering prayers under her breath. Elira did not know the woman's name. She only knew that an hour ago she had been scrubbing stone floors in the east corridor, and now she was being dressed like a bride for a king who did not know her face. "Stand still," hissed Lady Meredith, the older woman fixing the veil. "If you move, the pins will show, and if the pins show, we are all finished." "I do not understand," Elira whispered. "Why me? Why not one of the other maids?" "Because you are the only one who fits the gown," Meredith said, and there was no comfort in her voice, only fear. "Because Lady Priscilla is gone, and the king arrives within the hour, and if there is no bride waiting for him, this entire court burns."
Elira's stomach turned.
She had heard the whispers that morning, servants passing rumors like coins between clenched fists. Lady Priscilla Hartwell, the noblewoman chosen to bind herself to the Alpha King, had vanished sometime in the night. No note, no trace. Just an empty chamber and a window left open to the cold. "She ran," one maid had said. "She was taken," another had argued. Nobody knew which was true. All Elira knew was that the council, in its panic, had looked at the list of women in the palace, close enough to Priscilla's height and coloring, and her name had risen to the top like a stone dropped in still water. "I never agreed to this," Elira said. But even as she said it, she understood it did not matter. Nobody had asked her. A guard had pulled her from the laundry room by the wrist and marched her to this chamber, and here she was now, wrapped in silk that did not belong to her, waiting to be presented to a king who could kill her with a single command if he wished. Lord Edric entered without knocking, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was the head of the council, a narrow man with narrow eyes, and even now, in the middle of his own scheme, he looked as though he might faint. "It is time," he said. "The king has entered the outer hall. He will be in the throne room within minutes." "Lord Edric," Elira said, stepping forward despite the warning look Meredith shot her. "If he discovers I am not Lady Priscilla." "He will not discover it," Edric snapped, though his voice cracked on the last word. "You will keep your eyes down. You will speak only when spoken to. You will let the ceremony proceed, and by the time anyone realizes what has happened, the binding will be complete, and it cannot be undone." "And if it can?" Elira asked. "What happens to me?" Edric did not answer. He simply turned and walked out, leaving the question hanging in the cold air of the chamber like a blade waiting to fall. Meredith took Elira's face in both hands, her expression softening for just a moment. "Listen to me. Whatever happens in that hall, do not run. Running will only make it worse. Keep your head high. Let them believe you belong there, even if you do not believe it yourself." Elira wanted to ask how anyone could believe such a lie, but there was no time. The doors at the end of the corridor swung open, and 2 guards in the deep green of the royal house stepped forward to escort her. The walk to the throne room felt endless. Every polished tile beneath her slippers seemed to whisper accusations. Every portrait of a long-dead king seemed to watch her with open suspicion. She kept her chin lifted the way Meredith had told her, though her knees threatened to give out with every step. When the great doors opened, the noise of the court hit her like a wave. Hundreds of nobles filled the hall, dressed in silks and furs, their voices a low murmur that fell into silence the moment she appeared. At the far end of the room, upon a raised dais lined with dark stone, stood the throne of the Alpha King, and beside it stood the king himself. Draven was not what Elira expected. She had imagined a monster wrapped in a crown, cruel-eyed and cold, the kind of man the maid spoke of in frightened tones. Instead, she saw a tall figure with dark hair, swept back from a sharp, composed face, dressed simply in black and silver, no crown upon his head, only a thin circlet that caught the torchlight. His eyes, however, were not simple at all. They were pale gold, unblinking, and they fixed on her the moment she crossed the threshold with an intensity that made her want to turn and flee. She did not flee. She walked, one careful step after another, down the long aisle between rows of watching nobles, her veil trembling with every breath she tried to steady. The council stood near the dais, faces arranged into expressions of practiced calm that did nothing to hide the sweat on their brows. Lord Edric would not meet her eyes. Lady Meredith stood with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Elira reached the base of the dais and stopped, exactly where she had been instructed. She lowered her eyes, as commanded, and waited for the ceremony to begin. It did not begin the way she expected. Draven did not speak the ceremonial words. He did not step forward to take her hand. Instead, he remained utterly still, his gaze narrowing, his head tilting slightly to one side, in a manner that reminded Elira, absurdly, of an animal catching an unfamiliar scent on the wind. The silence stretched long enough that the murmurs in the hall began again, uncertain and hushed. "Something is wrong," Draven said. His voice was low, but it carried through the entire hall, as though the stones themselves had been built to obey him. Lord Edric stepped forward quickly. "Your Majesty, if there is some concern about the ceremony, we can certainly—" "Be silent," Draven said, without even glancing at him. He descended one step from the dais, and Elira's heart nearly stopped. He was close enough now that she could see the faint shift in his jaw, the way his nostrils flared slightly as he studied her. She kept her eyes down, praying to whatever gods might be listening that the veil hid enough of her face. "Lift your veil," Draven said. The command was quiet, but it was absolute. There was no room in it for refusal. Elira's hands trembled as she reached up and lifted the delicate fabric away from her face. The hall seemed to hold its breath as she did, hundreds of nobles leaning forward just slightly, eager for whatever was about to happen. Draven looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, not yet, with something closer to confusion, as though he were solving a puzzle whose pieces did not match the picture on the box. "You are not Lady Priscilla Hartwell," he said. It was not a question. The hall erupted into gasps and frantic whispers. Lord Edric's face went the color of old parchment. Lady Meredith pressed a hand to her mouth. Elira felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she had not moved an inch. "Your Majesty," Edric began again, his voice climbing toward panic. "There has been a slight change in circumstance, but the young woman is more than capable of—" "I did not ask you," Draven said, his golden eyes still locked on Elira. "I asked her." Elira swallowed hard. She thought of Meredith's warning not to run, not to flinch, to let them believe she belonged. But there was no belief left to salvage. The king had seen through the lie in the space of a single breath, and now every eye in the hall was upon her, waiting for her to either confirm the deception, or deny it, and doom herself either way. "No," Elira said quietly. Her voice did not shake as much as she expected it to. "I am not Lady Priscilla." The words landed in the hall like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of shock through every row of nobles. Somewhere behind her, a woman fainted, and the sound of a body hitting marble briefly overtook the murmuring crowd. Draven's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a stillness settling over him that was somehow more frightening than open anger. "Then who are you?" he said, "and why are you standing in her place?" Elira glanced once at Lord Edric, whose face had gone rigid with terror, silently begging her without words to protect the lie a moment longer. She thought of the guard who had dragged her from the laundry room without explanation. She thought of the fear in Meredith's eyes as she pinned the veil. She thought of the strange comfort of simply obeying, of letting the powerful people around her decide her fate as they always had. And then she thought of what would happen if she lied to an Alpha King and was caught in it twice. "My name is Elira," she said, lifting her chin the way Meredith had told her, though this time it was not obedience driving her, but something else entirely. "I am a maid in this palace. I was told to wear this gown an hour ago. I was not given a choice." A ripple of astonishment moved through the crowd. Somewhere in the back, a noblewoman let out a scandalized laugh, quickly stifled. Draven's gaze remained fixed on Elira, unreadable, assessing. "A maid," he repeated slowly, as though tasting the word. "Yes, Your Majesty. And you were placed here, in the gown of my intended bride, before an entire court, without being told why." "Yes." Draven turned then, finally, toward the council, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees despite the roaring fireplace along the far wall. Lord Edric took an involuntary step back, colliding with Lady Meredith, who did not move to steady him. "Explain," Draven said. Just the one word, but it carried the weight of a verdict already half decided. Edric's mouth opened and closed several times before words finally came. "Your Majesty," Lady Priscilla disappeared from her chamber sometime last night. We searched everywhere. We found nothing. The binding ceremony could not be postponed without causing a diplomatic incident with her family's pack, so we made the decision, in the interest of preserving peace, to deceive me, Draven finished for him. To buy time, Edric said weakly. Nothing more. Draven turned back to Alira, and for a moment, something flickered behind his golden eyes that she could not name. Not warmth, not yet. But not the cold fury she expected either. You could have said nothing, he said. You could have let the ceremony proceed and hoped no one noticed. Many in your position would have. I did not want to be bound to a lie, Alira said simply. Whatever comes next, at least it will be the truth. The hall had gone utterly silent now, every noble straining to hear the exchange between the king and the maid who had somehow, in the space of a few sentences, upended the entire ceremony, meant to bind him for life. Draven studied her a moment longer, and then he turned to address the whole of the court, his voice carrying effortlessly to the farthest corners of the hall. There will be no binding ceremony today, he announced. The council has attempted to deceive their king in the matter of his own marriage, and that deception will be answered. Lady Priscilla Hartwell remains missing, and I intend to know why, and I intend to know who is responsible. He looked once more at Alira, and something in his gaze made her feel, for the first time since she had been pulled from the laundry room, that perhaps she was not simply a piece to be moved and discarded. As for you, he said, you will not be punished for a lie you did not create, but you will remain in this palace until I understand exactly what has happened here, and what part you were meant to play in it. Guards moved to flank her on either side, not roughly, but with clear purpose. Alira glanced once at Lord Edric, whose face had drained of all color, and at Lady Meredith, who would not meet her eyes at all. As she was led from the throne room, the murmurs of the court rising behind her like a rising tide, Alira understood one thing, with sudden, sharp clarity. Whatever the council had planned when they placed her in that gown, the king's refusal to accept the lie had changed everything, and she had no idea, walking through those tall palace doors, whether she had just saved her own life or ended it. The guards led her not toward the dungeons, as she half expected, but toward a small chamber near the western wing, one used for visiting dignitaries rather than prisoners. The door was locked behind her all the same, and through the narrow window she could see the last light of the afternoon fading over the palace gardens. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the gown that did not belong to her, and pressed her palms against her eyes. Her whole body was shaking now that the danger had passed, the way it always seemed to happen, the fear arriving late, after the moment that demanded courage had already come and gone. A soft knock came at the door sometime later, and a young servant girl entered carrying a tray of bread and water. She would not look at Alira directly, though her eyes kept flicking toward her with open curiosity. They are saying strange things about you in the kitchens, the girl said quietly, setting the tray on a small table. Some say the king wanted to have you thrown from the tower for the deception. Others say he has already decided to keep you close, to learn what truly happened to Lady Priscilla. What do you believe? Alira asked. The girl hesitated at the door. I believe no one really knows what an Alpha King is thinking until he has already acted on it. The door closed again, and Alira was left alone with the tray of untouched food and the weight of everything that had happened crashing down upon her at once. She had walked into that hall expecting to play a small, silent part in someone else's lie. Instead, she had unraveled it in front of the entire court, and now her fate rested in the hands of a king whose golden eyes had studied her as though she were something far more interesting than a maid caught in a scheme not of her making. Outside her window, the sun disappeared fully behind the palace walls, and somewhere deep within the stone corridors, the search for the truth about Lady Priscilla Hartwell, and about the woman who had almost taken her place, had only just begun. 3 sharp knocks pulled Alira from a sleep she had not meant to fall into, and before she could answer, the door swung open on its own. King Draven stood in the frame, no guards beside him this time, no crown, no council trailing at his heels. Just the man himself, filling the small doorway with a presence that seemed far too large for the modest chamber she had been given. Alira scrambled upright, smoothing the wrinkled folds of a gown that no longer felt like a costume, but like a mistake she was still wearing. Your Majesty, she said, bowing her head quickly. Sit, Draven said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. I did not come here for ceremony. She sat, though every instinct told her to remain standing in the presence of a king. He did not sit across from her. Instead, he stood near the window, arms crossed, studying the darkening gardens outside, as though the answers he sought might be hiding among the hedges. I have spent the last several hours questioning the council, he said. Lord Edric insists this was a decision made in panic, to protect the peace between our lands and the Hartwell family. He says no harm was meant toward you specifically. Do you believe him? Alira asked. Draven turned, and his golden eyes settled on her, with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself not to. I believe men in fear tell themselves whatever story lets them sleep at night. Whether that story is true is a different matter entirely. What will happen to me? Alira asked. It was the question that had kept her awake long after the servant girl's tray had gone cold beside her. That depends on what you tell me now, Draven said. Start from the beginning. Tell me exactly how you came to be standing in that gown. Alira folded her hands in her lap, trying to steady the tremor still living beneath her skin. I was in the laundry room before dawn, same as every morning. A guard came and pulled me out without explanation. He brought me to a chamber near the east wing, where Lady Meredith was waiting with the gown already laid out. She told me Lady Priscilla was gone, and that I was needed to take her place for the ceremony. Needed, Draven repeated, the word carrying an edge of contempt, though not, she noticed, directed at her. Did anyone explain why you specifically were chosen? Lady Meredith said I was the only maid close enough to Lady Priscilla's height and coloring, to fit the gown without alteration. Draven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A convenient excuse. There are dozens of servants in this palace. It seems unlikely that you were the only possible match. Alira had not considered that before, but hearing him say it aloud, doubt crept into her chest like cold water. You think there was another reason? I think, Draven said slowly, that a plan built in a single panic night does not usually run as smoothly as this one did. The gown fit, the veil was ready. Lady Meredith knew exactly what to say to keep you compliant. That is not the work of desperate men improvising in darkness. That is the work of something planned in advance. The thought settled over Alira like a shadow crossing the sun. Then Lady Priscilla's disappearance was not an accident the council merely reacted to. That is what I intend to discover, Draven said. And you, whether you wish it or not, are now a part of that discovery. You were close enough to the plan to be pulled into it within the hour. That means someone believed you would not fight back, or that if you did, it would not matter. Alira felt something harden inside her at those words, a small ember of resolve she had not expected to find. Then whoever chose me made a mistake. For the first time since he had entered the room, something like the beginning of respect flickered across Draven's face. Perhaps, he said. Tell me about Lady Meredith. How well do you know her? Barely at all. She oversees several of the noble ladies' chambers. I have passed her in the halls, nothing more. She has never spoken to me directly before today. And Lord Edric? I did not know his name until this morning, when the other maids spoke of the council in fearful whispers. I have never exchanged a single word with him. Draven paced the small width of the chamber, his footsteps silent despite his size, the way a predator moves when it does not wish to be heard. Then it is unlikely either of them chose you personally. Someone else identified you as a suitable substitute and passed that information along. Who would know me well enough to suggest my name? Alira asked, more to herself than to him. That is precisely the question I intend to answer, Draven said. He stopped his pacing and looked at her directly. You will remain in the palace under guard, not as a prisoner, but as a witness whose safety I cannot yet guarantee. Whoever arranged this may not be finished, and if they believe you know too much, you may become inconvenient to them. A chill moved through Alira at the word inconvenient, understanding exactly what it implied. You think I am in danger? I think, Draven said, that anyone clever enough to orchestrate the disappearance of a noblewoman and the deception of an alpha king in the same night is clever enough to remove a maid who might expose them, if given the opportunity. The weight of that truth settled heavily in the room. Alira thought of the guard who had pulled her from the laundry without a word of explanation, of Lady Meredith's trembling hands as she pinned the veil, of the fear she had mistaken for panic but which now seemed, in hindsight, closer to guilt. What do you want from me? She asked finally. I want you to remember everything, Draven said. Every detail, no matter how small. What Lady Meredith said, what the guard looked like, whether anyone else entered that chamber before you were brought to the throne room. Small details are often the only threads that unravel a larger scheme. Illyra closed her eyes, forcing herself back through the frightened blur of that morning. There was a note, she said suddenly, her eyes opening. On the table beside the gown, before Lady Meredith noticed me looking at it and swept it away. I only saw a few words, something about a shipment, and a name I did not recognize. Corvin, I believe. Draven went very still. Corvin, he repeated. Are you certain of that name? As certain as I can be. I only glimpsed it for a moment. That is more than I expected to learn tonight, Draven said, and something in his voice had shifted, sharpened, the way a hunter's does when a trail finally becomes visible in the undergrowth. Corvin Ashgrove serves as steward to Lord Edric's estate. If his name appears connected to a note involving shipments on the very morning Lady Priscilla vanished, then the council's story of a spontaneous panic becomes far less believable. You believe Lord Edric is more involved than he admitted? I believe, Draven said, that Lord Edric may not even know the full extent of what has been done in his own household. He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between calculation and reluctant curiosity. You have given me more in one conversation than my own counsel offered in an entire afternoon of questioning. I have no reason to protect them, Illyra said. They used me without asking, and would have let me stand in that hall as a lie for the rest of my life, if you had not seen through it. No, Draven agreed. You have no reason to protect them at all. He studied her a moment longer, and Illyra had the strange sensation of being measured against some invisible standard, weighed and found, for the first time in her life, not lacking. Rest tonight. I will post guards outside your door, not to keep you in, but to keep others out. Tomorrow, we begin tracing the name Corvin Ashgrove, and wherever that trail leads, I suspect it will not be a comfortable place for the council to stand. He left without another word, the door closing softly behind him, and Illyra sat alone in the quiet chamber for a long while, turning the events of the day over in her mind. She had expected to be punished, or forgotten, or quietly disposed of, in whatever manner the palace dealt with inconvenient servants who had seen too much. Instead, the Alpha King himself had sat across from her, treating her words as though they carried weight, as though she were not merely a maid caught in someone else's scheme, but a piece of the puzzle he intended to solve. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lady Meredith's trembling hands, heard the desperate edge in Lord Edric's voice, remembered the single glimpsed word on a note swept away before she could read more. Somewhere in the palace, someone had planned her involvement carefully, had known she would fit the gown, had perhaps even known she would be too frightened to resist. That person had made one critical miscalculation, however. They had not accounted for a king whose senses could not be fooled by silk and lace, nor for a maid who, once cornered, chose truth over survival through silence. As the night deepened, and the guards took their positions outside her door, Illyra allowed herself, for the first time since the ordeal began, a single, fragile thought. Perhaps she was not simply a victim of this scheme. Perhaps, standing at the center of a conspiracy too large for her to fully understand, she had also become something the conspirators had never intended to create. A witness, the king himself now trusted, more than his own counsel. Near midnight, a soft sound at the window pulled her from a shallow doze. She rose quietly, pressing herself against the wall beside the glass, heart pounding as she peered out into the darkness. A figure moved along the garden path below, cloaked and hurried, careful to keep to the shadows cast by the hedges. She could not make out a face, only the shape of someone who did not wish to be seen crossing that particular stretch of ground at that particular hour. She thought of calling out to the guards stationed at her door, but hesitated, some instinct warning her that revealing what she had seen too quickly might only teach the culprit to be more careful. Instead, she watched until the figure disappeared through a servant's entrance near the eastern wall, memorizing the direction, the pace, the faint limp in the left step that seemed to favor one leg over the other. When morning came, she requested to see the king again, and to her surprise, the request was granted within the hour. Draven listened without interrupting as she described the figure in the garden, his expression unreadable until she mentioned the limp. A limp, he said, his voice quiet but intent. Favoring which side? The left, Illyra said. It was subtle, but clear enough, once I watched for more than a few steps. Draven was silent for a long moment, something working behind his golden eyes. There is a groundskeeper in Lord Edric's household who suffered an injury some years ago in a hunting accident. He has favored his left leg ever since. I have seen him only a handful of times, but the detail is not one I would easily forget. You believe it was him? I believe it is worth finding out, Draven said. A groundskeeper moving through the palace gardens at midnight, avoiding the guarded paths, is either running an errand he does not wish witnessed, or delivering something he does not wish traced back to its source. Could this connect to the note I saw, the one mentioning Corvin and a shipment? It is possible, Draven said. A shipment moved under cover of darkness, delivered by a servant, unlikely to be questioned, arranged by a household steward, whose name appeared on a note meant to remain hidden. These pieces are beginning to form a shape I do not like. Illyra felt a flicker of something unfamiliar rise in her chest, sitting across from a king, who spoke to her not as a servant to be dismissed, but as a mind capable of noticing what others missed. What shape is that? A shape where Lady Priscilla's disappearance was not the desperate flight of a frightened bride, nor a simple abduction born of opportunity, Draven said. A shape where someone within these walls arranged everything long before that night ever arrived, down to the very gown that would replace her should she vanish according to plan. The words settled over the small chamber like a held breath. Illyra thought of the perfectly fitted dress, the veil already prepared, Lady Meredith's practiced hands moving with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the task before it was ever required of her. They knew this would happen, she said slowly. Before it happened. That is my growing suspicion, Draven said, which means whoever is behind this did not simply seize an opportunity when Lady Priscilla vanished. They created the opportunity themselves, and prepared every piece required to hide it, including you. Illyra's hands curled into fists in her lap. Then I was never meant to be a witness to this. I was meant to be a tool, used and discarded once the ceremony was finished. Yes, Draven said simply, without softening the truth for her comfort. And that is precisely why you are now more valuable to me than any noble seated on my council. You were meant to disappear into a role, and vanish from memory once your purpose was served. Instead, you are still here, still asking questions, still remembering details others hoped you would forget out of fear. For the first time since the ordeal began, Illyra allowed herself to feel something other than fear or confusion. A quiet, steady anger had begun to take root instead, and beneath the king's watchful golden gaze, she found she did not want to hide it. The groundskeeper was gone before the guards reached his quarters. Illyra learned this from a servant boy who delivered her breakfast, his voice hushed with the particular excitement of someone carrying news too large for a single pair of ears. The man's small room near the stables had been emptied in the night, bed still made, belongings vanished as though he had never lived there at all. They say he left no trace, the boy whispered, setting down her tray. Not a coat, not a boot, nothing behind. Only the guards outside found strange marks near the servants' gate this morning. Drag marks, some say. Others say nothing of the kind. Illyra thanked him, and sent him away, her appetite gone the moment the door closed. She dressed quickly and requested to see the king, and once again, the request was granted faster than she expected, of someone still technically a stranger to the palace's proper order. Draven met her not in her chamber this time, but in a smaller council room, its walls lined with old maps and ledgers, the fire burning low in the hearth. Lord Edric was there as well, along with a stern-faced woman Illyra did not recognize, introduced only as Commander Yseult, head of the palace guard. The groundskeeper is gone, Draven said without preamble, once Illyra had taken the seat offered to her. Either he fled on his own, once he suspected he had been seen, or he was removed by someone who feared what he might reveal under questioning. Removed, Lord Edric repeated, his face pale. You believe he was silenced. I believe it is a possibility we cannot ignore, Draven said. Commander Yseult found drag marks near the servants' gate, along with a torn piece of fabric caught on the iron hinge. The fabric matches the uniform worn by groundskeepers in this household. Commander Yseult placed a small scrap of cloth on the table, dark green, roughened at the edge, as though torn free in a struggle. Illyra stared at it, feeling the weight of what it implied settle over the room. If he was taken against his will, Yseult said, Then whoever arranged Lady Priscilla's disappearance is willing to silence anyone who threatens to expose them, including their own accomplices. Lord Edric's hands trembled visibly against the table's edge. This is beyond anything I sanctioned. I swear to you, Your Majesty, I knew nothing of a groundskeeper's involvement, nothing of any shipment, nothing of any note bearing my steward's name. And yet your steward's name appears at the center of this, Draven said, his voice cool and even. Where is Corvin Ashgrove now? In my estate outside the city walls, overseeing the harvest accounts, as he has been for the past several weeks, Edric said quickly. I can send for him at once. Do so, Draven said. And in the meantime, I want every servant who worked near Lady Priscilla's chamber the night she vanished, questioned again, this time separately, and this time by Commander Yseult, rather than by members of your own household staff. Edric nodded stiffly and hurried from the room, clearly relieved to be given a task rather than remain under the weight of the king's suspicion. Once he was gone, Yseult turned to Alira with sharp, assessing eyes. You saw the groundskeeper in the garden the night before he disappeared. Tell me again exactly what you observed. Alira recounted the details as precisely as she could, the hurried figure, the careful path avoiding guarded routes, the subtle limp favoring the left leg. Yseult listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at Draven as though confirming some private understanding between them. If he was already planning to flee, Yseult said once Alira finished, he would not have needed to be dragged from his quarters. A man fleeing on his own does not usually leave drag marks and torn fabric behind. Meaning someone caught him before he could run, Draven said. Or someone made certain he never had the chance, Yseult finished grimly. The conversation turned toward logistics then, plans to search the surrounding roads, to question anyone who might have seen a cart or carriage leaving the servants' gate under cover of darkness. Alira listened, feeling increasingly like a small boat caught in a current far larger than she had ever imagined a single missing noblewoman could create. When the meeting finally ended, and Yseult departed to organize her search parties, Draven remained behind, studying Alira with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Thoughtful, calculating, though never unkind. You look troubled, he said. I keep thinking of what might have happened to that groundskeeper, because of what I saw, Alira said. If I had said nothing about the figure in the garden, would he still be safely asleep in his quarters this morning? Do not carry that burden, Draven said, his tone firmer than she expected. If he was taken, it was because those responsible feared what he already knew, not because you noticed him crossing a garden path. You did not create this danger. You simply refused to look away from it. That is easy to say, Alira murmured. And harder to believe, when a man may have disappeared because I mentioned seeing him. Draven was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened slightly, though it lost none of its weight. In my experience, the ones who suffer most in schemes like this are rarely the ones who speak the truth. They are the ones who stay silent, believing silence will keep them safe, only to discover too late that silence protects no one once the truth begins to surface regardless. Alira absorbed that, turning the words over slowly. You speak as though you have seen this before. I have seen enough of court politics to recognize its patterns, Draven said. Ambition dressed as loyalty, fear dressed as duty. Men and women alike convincing themselves that small betrayals serve some greater good, until the betrayals grow too large to control. Is that what happened to Lady Priscilla? Alira asked. A small betrayal that grew beyond what anyone intended? That is what I intend to discover, Draven said. And you, whether by circumstance or by some design I have not yet uncovered, continue to find yourself standing closer to the truth than anyone else in this palace. A knock interrupted them, and a young guard entered, bowing quickly before delivering his message. Your Majesty, a rider has returned from Lord Edric's estate. Corvin Ashgrove cannot be found. The estate steward's quarters have been empty for several days, according to the household staff there. Draven's expression darkened. Several days. Before Lady Priscilla ever vanished. Yes, Your Majesty. The guard withdrew, and silence settled heavily over the small council room. Alira watched the king's face, seeing calculation shift into something closer to certainty. He left before she disappeared, Alira said slowly, understanding dawning even as she spoke the words aloud. That means, whatever role he played, it was arranged well in advance, Yes, Draven said. Which tells me this was never a single night's panic, nor a single desperate decision made by frightened council members. This was planned, carefully, by someone patient enough to move the necessary pieces into place, long before the ceremony ever began. Who would benefit from Lady Priscilla vanishing? Illyra asked. Who gains from a broken binding between you and her family's pack? Draven's gaze sharpened, and for the first time, Illyra saw something close to genuine surprise cross his face, as though she had asked precisely the question he had been circling, without quite reaching himself. That, he said slowly, is the question that matters most. Lady Priscilla's binding to me would have secured an alliance between two of the largest packs in this region. Anyone opposed to that alliance, anyone who stood to lose power or influence should it succeed, would have strong reason to see it fail. And replacing her with a maid who could easily be blamed and discarded, Illyra said, the pieces settling into place with sickening clarity, would ensure the failure looked like chaos and incompetence rather than a deliberate plot. Precisely, Draven said, which means whoever orchestrated this did not simply want Lady Priscilla gone. They wanted the alliance itself destroyed, and they wanted the blame to fall anywhere except on themselves. Illyra sat back, the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on her more heavily than before. She had thought herself merely an unfortunate maid pulled into someone else's desperate scheme. Now she understood she had been placed at the center of something far larger, a plot aimed not simply at a missing bride, but at the stability of an alliance between packs, orchestrated by someone patient enough and powerful enough to move a steward and a groundskeeper into hiding without leaving more than a torn scrap of fabric behind. Then we are not simply searching for Lady Priscilla, she said quietly. No, Draven agreed, his golden eyes hard with resolve. We are searching for whoever believes they can dismantle an alliance between packs and hide behind the panic of a frightened council. And I intend to find them before they realize how much you and I have already uncovered. That evening, Draven summoned a small map to be brought to the council room, marking the roads leading away from the estate where Corvin Ashgrove had last been seen. Illyra watched as he traced possible routes with a steady finger, calculating distances, considering where a man wishing to vanish without notice might choose to hide. If he left before Lady Priscilla vanished, she said, studying the map alongside him, then perhaps he was not fleeing at all. Perhaps he was sent somewhere to prepare for what came next. Draven glanced at her, something like approval flickering across his face. That is a possibility I had not fully considered. If he was sent ahead, rather than fleeing in fear, it suggests an organized effort with a destination already chosen, rather than a man panicking after the fact. Where would such a destination be? Illyra asked. Somewhere far enough from the palace to avoid suspicion, yet close enough to remain useful to whoever is directing this, Draven said. He traced a line along the map toward a cluster of smaller villages near the northern border. There are several holdings in this region loosely connected to families who have long resented the growing influence of the Hartwell pack. If someone among them sought to prevent the alliance, this is where I would expect to find evidence of their involvement. You believe a rival family is behind this, Illyra said. I believe it is the most logical explanation, though I will not commit to certainty until I have proof, Draven said. Ambition rarely announces itself plainly. It hides behind loyal servants, behind frightened councils, behind maids, dressed in borrowed gowns, who never ask to be part of any of it. Illyra felt the weight of his gaze as he said the last part, and she found herself unable to look away from those pale golden eyes, steady and unblinking, holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, for reasons she did not fully understand.
I did not ask for any of this, she said quietly, and yet I find I do not wish to simply return to the laundry room and forget it happened, even if that were possible.
Why not? Draven asked, genuine curiosity coloring his voice. Because whoever did this believed a maid would be too frightened to matter, Illyra said. They believed I would disappear quietly into the role they assigned me, the way Lady Priscilla was meant to disappear from her own life entirely. I do not wish to prove them right. Something shifted in Draven's expression then, subtle but unmistakable, a kind of recognition passing between them that had nothing to do with crowns or council chambers, or the politics of pacts and alliances. Then we are aligned in purpose, he said. I do not intend to let whoever orchestrated this believe they have succeeded either. The council room fell quiet around them, the fire crackling low in the hearth, the map spread between them like a puzzle only half solved. Elira studied the marked villages near the northern border, committing the names to memory, understanding that whatever came next would carry her far beyond the palace walls she had scrubbed clean for 3 quiet years, into a conspiracy whose full shape neither of them yet understood. Rest tonight, Draven said finally, straightening from the map. Tomorrow, I will send riders north to investigate quietly, without alerting whoever may be watching from within these walls. In the meantime, you will remain close to me, where I can ensure your safety. Close to you, Elira repeated, unable to keep a note of surprise from her voice. You have become a target the moment you spoke the truth in that hall, Draven said simply. I do not intend to lose the one witness bold enough to speak it. He left her then, and Elira sat alone in the quiet council room for a long while, watching the fire burn lower in the hearth, turning over the strange, unexpected shift that had occurred within her over the course of a single frightening day. She had arrived at the palace 3 years ago, as an invisible girl scrubbing floors no one bothered to notice. Now she sat at the center of a conspiracy, threatening to unravel an alliance between 2 great packs, trusted by a king whose golden eyes seemed to see through every lie placed before him. Except, she realized with a small and unfamiliar warmth, whatever it was he saw when he looked at her. A pounding on the door tore Elira from sleep before dawn had fully broken. She sat up quickly, disoriented, the unfamiliar room still strange to her after only a handful of nights. The pounding came again, more urgent this time, and a voice called through the wood, low and clipped. Miss Elira, the king requests your presence immediately. She dressed as fast as her trembling hands allowed, pulling on the simple gray dress that had replaced the borrowed bridal gown, and followed the guard through corridors still dim with early morning shadow. Something in the air felt different, tighter, as though the palace itself had drawn a nervous breath and forgotten to release it. Draven waited in the same council room as before, but this time Commander Ysault stood beside him, along with 2 riders still dressed in travel-worn cloaks, mud splattered up to their knees. Their faces were grim in a way that made Elira's stomach tighten before a single word was spoken. Tell her what you told me, Draven said to the riders. The taller of the 2 cleared his throat. We rode north through the night, to the villages you marked on the map, Your Majesty. In the second village, a farmer reported seeing a covered cart pass through nearly 2 weeks past, escorted by 3 men on horseback. He remembered it because the cart moved slowly, as though carrying something heavy, and because one of the riders wore the deep green of Lord Edric's household colors. 2 weeks, Elira said quietly, before Lady Priscilla vanished. Yes, Draven said, confirming what we suspected. This was planned well in advance, moved into position long before the night everyone believed it began. The second rider spoke next, his voice lower, more hesitant. There is more, Your Majesty. The farmer also mentioned a woman's voice from within the cart, calling out once before the escort silenced her. He could not make out the words, only that it sounded like pleading. The room went very still. Elira felt a cold weight settle in her chest at the thought of Lady Priscilla, a woman she had never met, carried away in the dark by men in stolen colors, pleading from beneath a cart's covering, while her own household prepared to erase her from the ceremony entirely. Is she still alive? Elira asked, the question slipping out before she could measure its weight. We do not know, Draven admitted, his voice grim. But a captive is more valuable than a corpse to whoever orchestrated this. If their intention was simply to remove her, there would be no need for such careful planning. No need for a substitute prepared and ready to take her place. They wanted her gone from the ceremony, not necessarily gone from the world. Why keep her alive at all? Commander Ysault asked. If she is found, she can identify her captors and unravel the entire plot. Perhaps that is precisely why they wish to keep her, Draven said slowly, something dawning behind his golden eyes. A living hostage carries leverage, a dead one does not. If Lady Priscilla's family, or her pack, ever suspected foul play rather than simple flight, her captors could produce her, alive and coerced, to say whatever story best protects them. Elira felt sick at the thought, imagining a woman forced to lie about her own disappearance to protect the very people who had stolen her life from her. Then finding her before that happens is more urgent than ever. Agreed, Draven said. He turned to the riders. Continue north. Question every village along that road. I want to know exactly where that cart was headed, and I want it found before whoever is holding her decides she has outlived her usefulness. The riders bowed and departed quickly, leaving Draven, Yseult, and Alira alone in the council room once more. Yseult excused herself soon after to organize additional search parties, leaving the king and Alira facing one another, across the map still spread upon the table. You look pale, Draven observed. I keep thinking of her, Alira admitted. Lady Priscilla. I never met her, yet everyone believed I could simply take her place, as though she were nothing more than a gown to be filled by whoever fit it best. No one who orchestrated this views her as more than a piece to be moved, Draven said. That is precisely the kind of thinking I intend to make them regret. Alira studied him for a long moment, something in his tone catching her attention. You speak of this as though it is personal to you, beyond simply solving a conspiracy against your throne. Draven was quiet for a moment, his jaw tightening slightly before he answered. I have watched ambitious men treat people as instruments before, disposable once their purpose is served. It is not a pattern I forget easily, nor one I am willing to allow to succeed twice in my lifetime. Alira wanted to ask what he meant by twice, sensing there was history behind the words he had chosen, but something in his expression told her the moment was not right to press further. Instead, she asked a different question, one that had been circling her thoughts since the writer's report. If Lady Priscilla is being kept alive as leverage, what happens to me? I am not a hostage with value to bargain over. I am simply a maid who saw too much. Draven's expression shifted, something protective flickering briefly across his sharp features, before settling back into calm control. You are safer within these walls than outside them, under my protection, rather than left to whatever fate the conspirators might choose for a witness they consider inconvenient. That is why I have kept you close, and why I intend to continue doing so until this matter is resolved. And after it is resolved, Alira asked, unable to stop herself, what happens to a maid who has seen the inner workings of a conspiracy against pacts and thrones? Do I simply return to scrubbing floors, expected to forget everything I have witnessed? The question hung in the air longer than she expected, and for a moment, Draven did not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more careful than she had heard it before. I do not yet know the answer to that, he admitted. But I find myself, against every expectation I carried into that throne room only days ago, unwilling to simply return you to the obscurity you came from. Alira did not know how to respond to that, her heart beating a strange, uneven rhythm she chose not to examine too closely. Before she could find words, a soft knock interrupted them, and a servant entered bearing a folded letter, sealed in dark wax and marked with an unfamiliar sigil. Draven took it, breaking the seal with a frown that deepened as he read. This is addressed to me, delivered anonymously through the palace gate this morning, according to the guard who received it. What does it say? Alira asked. Draven's expression darkened further as he finished reading, and he set the letter down on the table between them, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. It says that Lady Priscilla remains alive, for now, and that her continued safety depends entirely on whether I continue investigating her disappearance. It warns me to abandon the search, or face the consequence of her death. Alira's breath caught. They are threatening her life to stop you from finding them. Yes, Draven said, his golden eyes hardening into something cold and unyielding, which tells me we are closer to the truth than they anticipated, and that they are frightened enough of discovery to resort to direct threats rather than simply continuing to hide in the shadows. Will you stop the search? Alira asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Draven looked at her, and something fierce and unshakable settled over his features. No, I will not allow fear to dictate the safety of my kingdom, nor the life of a woman who was stolen from her own wedding, by cowards hiding behind stolen colors and anonymous letters. If anything, this threat only confirms how close we truly are to unraveling their entire scheme. Alira felt a strange mixture of fear and admiration rise within her, watching the king's resolve harden rather than crack beneath the weight of the threat. Whoever had written that letter had clearly expected fear to slow him. Instead, it had only sharpened his determination, and Alira found herself, despite everything, standing firmly beside him in that resolve. Then we continue, she said quietly. Yes, Draven agreed. We continue, more carefully than before, and with the understanding that whoever sent this letter is watching closely enough to know exactly how their threats might land. That means someone within these very walls may still be reporting our progress to them, whether by choice or by coercion. The realization settled heavily over the room. Somewhere within the palace, someone trusted enough to move freely among the council and its servants was passing information to whoever held Lady Priscilla captive, and until that person was identified, every step forward carried the risk of being anticipated before it was even taken. "We must be careful about who else learns of this letter," Alira said. "If the traitor is close enough to the council to know our plans, they may also be close enough to learn we received this warning." "A wise observation," Draven said, folding the letter and tucking it away inside his coat. "I will not share its contents with anyone beyond Commander Yusolt, and even then, only in private. The fewer who know, the smaller the chance of it reaching the wrong ears." "What of Lord Edric?" Alira asked. "He seems desperate to prove his innocence, yet his own steward and groundskeeper are both connected to this scheme." "Desperation does not always mean guilt," Draven said, "though it does not rule it out either. I intend to watch him closely, without revealing how much we already suspect. A frightened man who believes he is still trusted will often make mistakes a cautious one would avoid." Alira considered this, turning the strategy over in her mind. "Then we continue to let him believe his cooperation has satisfied you, while quietly watching for any misstep that might reveal more than he intends." "Precisely," Draven said, something like approval warming his tone. "You have a sharper mind for this than most of the nobles who have sat at that council table for years." The compliment settled strangely in her chest, warm and unfamiliar, and she found herself glancing away to hide whatever expression had crossed her face at his words. "I have spent 3 years watching this palace, from the corners of rooms no one thought to notice me in. Perhaps that has taught me more about its hidden currents than most nobles ever bother to learn." "Perhaps it has," Draven agreed, studying her with an expression that made her pulse quicken again, though she could not name exactly why. "It seems the palace has been underestimating you for far longer than a single day." Before either of them could say more, Commander Yusolt returned, her expression grave. "Your Majesty, I have organized 3 separate search parties to move north, along the road our riders identified. I have also placed additional guards near the servants' quarters, given what happened to the groundskeeper." "Good," Draven said. "And the letter?" "I have shown it to no one," Yusolt confirmed. "Though I would advise increasing your own personal guard as well, Your Majesty. If they are willing to threaten a hostage's life to slow your investigation, they may also consider more direct action against you, should threats alone fail to work." "I am not so easily removed," Draven said, a note of grim confidence entering his voice, though Alira noticed the way his hand tightened briefly at his side, a small gesture that suggested the threat weighed on him more than his words admitted. "Even kings can be surprised," Yusolt said carefully. "I would rather guard against that possibility than regret ignoring it later." Draven inclined his head, conceding the point. "Increase the guard then, but quietly. I do not wish to alert whoever is watching that we suspect a threat against my own safety, as well as Lady Priscilla's." Yusolt nodded and departed once more, leaving the council room quiet again. Alira watched the fire crackle low in the hearth, the weight of everything they had uncovered settling heavily over her thoughts. A hostage held captive somewhere north of the palace, a traitor hidden among the very people meant to serve the crown, a king now threatened not only in his authority, but potentially in his life, for daring to pursue the truth rather than accept a convenient lie. "You should rest," Draven said eventually, noticing the exhaustion clearly written across her face. "There is little more we can do until the search parties report back, and you have already given more to this investigation than anyone could have reasonably asked of you." "I do not think I could rest even if I tried," Alira admitted. "Not knowing Lady Priscilla is out there somewhere, frightened and waiting for someone to find her." "Then rest regardless," Draven said, his tone softening into something gentler than she had heard from him before. "Exhaustion will serve neither her nor this investigation. I will send word the moment anything changes, day or night." Alira nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily. As she rose to leave the council room, Draven's voice stopped her at the door. "Alira." She turned, surprised to hear her name spoken so plainly, without title or formality attached. "Thank you," he said simply, "for refusing to stay silent in that hall 3 days ago. Whatever comes of this investigation, it began because you chose truth over the safety of silence, and that choice may yet save a woman's life. Elira felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest at his words, and she left the council room that morning carrying not just fear for a stranger's fate, but a quiet, growing certainty that whatever happened next, she was no longer simply a maid caught in someone else's scheme. She had become something the conspirators had never planned for, a witness who refused to disappear, standing beside a king who, against all expectation, had chosen to trust her above all others. A scream from the eastern courtyard shattered the quiet of the afternoon, and Elira was on her feet before she understood why. She reached the window in time to see two guards wrestling a struggling figure to the ground, a young stable hand named Corin, his face twisted with panic as he shouted something Elira could not make out from the distance. By the time she made her way down to the courtyard, a small crowd of servants had already gathered, whispering behind raised hands. "What happened?" she asked one of the kitchen girls standing near the edge of the crowd. "They found him trying to slip a letter through the eastern gate," the girl whispered. "The guards say it was meant for someone outside the palace. He tried to run when they stopped him." Draven arrived moments later, his expression carved from stone as he approached the restrained stable hand. "Bring him to the council chamber," he ordered, and the guards obeyed at once, hauling the trembling young man to his feet. Elira followed at Draven's side, uninvited but unstopped, and found herself once again seated at the same table, where so much had already been uncovered. Corin was forced into a chair across from them, his hands bound, his eyes darting nervously between the king and Commander Isolde, who stood near the door with her arms crossed. "Explain yourself," Draven said, his voice deceptively calm. "I meant no harm, Your Majesty," Corin stammered. "I was only asked to deliver a message, nothing more." "Asked by whom?" Corin hesitated, and Isolde stepped forward, her expression hardening. "The king does not have patience for hesitation, boy. Speak." "I do not know his name," Corin said quickly. "A man approached me 3 nights past, in the stables, after most of the palace had gone to sleep. He offered coin, in exchange for delivering letters through the eastern gate, whenever he required it. He said no one would notice a stable boy slipping in and out." "Where did you take these letters?" Draven asked. "To a rider waiting just beyond the tree line," Corin said. "He never gave his name either. I only handed over the letter and received my payment in return." Draven produced the anonymous threat they had received earlier, holding it up before the frightened stable hand. "Does the seal on this letter match anything you have seen before?" Corin's eyes widened at the sight of the dark wax seal. "Yes," he whispered. "That is the same mark I have seen on letters I was asked to carry." Elira felt a cold certainty settle over her. The threats against Lady Priscilla's life, the conspiracy that had unraveled the ceremony, all of it connected through this frightened boy, who had likely never fully understood the danger he had been drawn into. "Who gave you the coin?" Draven pressed. "Describe him." "Tall, with a gray cloak pulled close around his face," Corin said. "I never saw more than his eyes, and even those only briefly in torchlight, but his voice was familiar somehow, though I could not place from where." "Familiar how?" Isolde asked sharply. "Like someone I had heard speak before, in passing, though I cannot say who," Corin admitted, clearly frustrated by his own uncertainty. "It has troubled me since, trying to place it, but I cannot." Draven studied the boy for a long moment, weighing the truth of his words. "You will remain under guard until this matter is resolved, not as punishment, but for your own protection. Whoever employed you may not look kindly upon your capture, and I do not intend to lose another witness to silence." Corin nodded, clearly relieved to be spared harsher punishment, and was led away by 2 guards to a secure chamber. Once he was gone, Draven turned to Elira, his expression troubled. "A voice he recognized but could not place," he said slowly. "That suggests someone within this palace, someone the boy has heard speak in passing, perhaps in the kitchens or the stables, without ever formally meeting them." "A noble, then," Elira said. "Someone who would rarely speak directly to a stable boy, yet whose voice might carry across a courtyard, or through an open window, or someone in a position of authority within the household staff," Draven added. "Someone who moves freely enough to be overheard by servants without drawing suspicion." Elira's mind raced through the faces she had encountered since the ordeal began, searching for anyone whose voice might match such a description. "Lady Meredith," she said suddenly. She oversees several of the noble ladies' chambers. Her voice would be heard often enough by servants throughout the palace, yet she rarely speaks directly to stable hands. Draven's expression sharpened. It is a possibility worth investigating, though I am reluctant to accuse her without more than a stable boy's uncertain memory to support it. She was the one who dressed me for the ceremony, Illyra reminded him. She knew exactly what to say to keep me compliant, exactly how the gown would fit. If she was involved from the beginning, she may also be connected to whoever holds Lady Priscilla now. Bring her here, Draven said to Yseult, who nodded and departed at once. Lady Meredith arrived within the hour, her composure carefully maintained, though Illyra noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she took the seat offered to her. Draven wasted no time with pleasantries. A stable boy was caught delivering letters through the eastern gate, he said. Letters bearing the same seal as a threat delivered to me regarding Lady Priscilla's safety. He described the voice of the man who employed him as familiar, though he could not place it. Meredith's face paled slightly, though her voice remained steady. I do not understand what this has to do with me, Your Majesty. You dressed Illyra for the ceremony, Draven said. You knew the gown would fit her precisely, knew exactly what words would keep her compliant despite the deception. That suggests either remarkable improvisation under pressure or prior knowledge of a plan already in motion. Meredith's hands twisted together in her lap. I was told only that Lady Priscilla had vanished, and that a substitute was required immediately to prevent diplomatic catastrophe. I did not question the details further than that. I was frightened, Your Majesty, not complicit. And yet you knew precisely how to keep a frightened maid calm and obedient, Draven pressed. Where did that knowledge come from? Meredith's composure finally cracked, tears welling in her eyes. I have served this council for many years, Your Majesty. I have learned, through long experience, how to manage frightened servants and nervous brides alike. That is the whole of my knowledge, nothing more sinister than years of practice. Draven studied her for a long moment, and Illyra found herself watching closely as well, trying to determine whether the tears were genuine fear or practiced deception. Something in the woman's trembling hands seemed too raw to be entirely performed, yet the coincidence of her involvement remained troubling. Where were you 3 nights past, after midnight? Draven asked. In my chambers, asleep, as I am every night, Meredith said. I have no one to confirm this, as I sleep alone, but I swear it is the truth. Convenient, Yseult murmured from near the door. I understand how it appears, Meredith said, her voice breaking slightly. But I swear to you, Your Majesty, I would never knowingly place a young woman in danger, nor participate in a scheme against Lady Priscilla's safety. I was afraid that night, following orders I did not fully understand, believing I was helping to prevent disaster rather than causing one. Draven remained silent for a long moment, weighing her words against everything else they had uncovered. Finally he spoke, his voice measured and careful. You will remain under watch until this matter is resolved. Not imprisoned, but observed. If you are innocent, as you claim, this will pass quickly enough. If you are not, I will discover it eventually. Meredith nodded, wiping at her eyes, and was escorted from the room by a guard stationed at the door. Once she was gone, Illyra turned to Draven, uncertainty coloring her voice. Do you believe her? I do not know, Draven admitted. Fear and guilt often wear the same expression, and I have learned not to trust appearances alone in matters as tangled as this one. But her involvement, whether willing or coerced, remains a thread we cannot afford to ignore. Illyra nodded, though a quiet unease settled over her at the thought that someone so close to her during those frightening first hours might have known far more than she had ever suspected. The conspiracy, it seemed, ran deeper and wider than either of them had first imagined, touching lives within the palace walls that Illyra had once considered as ordinary and overlooked as her own. Later that evening, after the council chamber had emptied and the guards had settled into their posts for the night, Illyra found herself walking the quiet halls near her chamber, unable to settle her restless thoughts enough to sleep. She had not expected to encounter Draven there, standing alone near a tall window that overlooked the darkened gardens, his expression distant and troubled. You should be resting, he said without turning, somehow aware of her presence before she had spoken a word. I could say the same to you, Illyra replied, stepping closer, despite the small voice in her mind, warning her that such familiarity toward a king was not something a maid should risk. Draven allowed himself a faint, tired smile. Kings rarely have the luxury of easy sleep, particularly when a conspiracy threatens both a hostage's life and the stability of an alliance between packs. "Do you truly believe Lady Meredith is guilty?" Elira asked, coming to stand beside him at the window. "I believe she may know more than she has admitted, whether through willing participation or simple fear," Draven said. "But I do not yet believe she is the architect behind all of this." Her fear seemed genuine, even if her explanations were incomplete. "Then who do you believe is truly responsible?" Elira asked. Draven was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkened gardens below. "I have my suspicions, though I am not yet ready to speak them aloud, even to you. I have learned, through painful experience, that naming a suspect too early can drive them into hiding before enough evidence exists to hold them accountable." Elira studied his profile in the dim light, noticing the tension carried in his jaw, the weight of responsibility etched into every line of his face. "You mentioned once that you have seen ambitious men treat people as instruments before. Was that simply an observation, or something more personal?" Draven's expression tightened, and for a moment, Elira thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a rare vulnerability she had not heard from him before. "My own father was manipulated in much the same way, decades ago, by a council eager to secure an advantageous alliance, regardless of the cost to those involved," he said quietly. "I watched, as a boy, the damage such schemes can cause when ambition is allowed to outweigh conscience. I swore, when I took the throne, that I would not allow the same patterns to repeat under my rule. And yet here we are," Elira said softly, "with a bride stolen, a maid deceived, and a conspiracy unraveling beneath the very throne you swore to protect from such schemes." "Yes," Draven admitted, "which is precisely why I intend to see this through to its end, regardless of threats, regardless of how deep the conspiracy runs, regardless of who within these walls may ultimately be revealed as its architect." Elira felt a quiet admiration swell within her, watching the resolve settle over him once more, banishing the brief vulnerability he had allowed her to witness. "You are not at all what I expected, when I stood before you in that borrowed gown, waiting for judgment." "Nor are you," Draven said, turning to look at her fully for the first time since she had joined him at the window. "I expected a frightened maid, willing to say whatever was necessary to survive the moment. Instead, I found someone unwilling to let a lie stand, even at great personal risk." The quiet intensity in his gaze made Elira's breath catch, and she found herself unable to look away, the space between them feeling smaller than it truly was. "I only did what felt right in that moment," she said quietly. "I did not expect it to lead me here, standing beside a king in the middle of the night, discussing conspiracies and stolen brides, as though I belonged in such conversations. Perhaps you belong here more than either of us expected," Draven said, his voice low and thoughtful. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the silence between them charged with something neither seemed willing to name aloud. Finally, Draven straightened, clearing his throat as though recalling himself to the responsibilities still awaiting him. "You should rest," he said again, though his voice had softened considerably from earlier. "Tomorrow will bring more questions, and I suspect fewer easy answers." Elira nodded, though she lingered a moment longer before finally turning toward her chamber, aware of his gaze following her down the darkened hall. As she lay awake that night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling above her borrowed bed, she found her thoughts returning not to Lady Priscilla's uncertain fate, nor to Lady Meredith's trembling denials, but to the rare vulnerability she had glimpsed in a king who carried far more weight upon his shoulders than his composed exterior ever revealed. The accusation came without warning, hurled across the servants' hall loud enough for every ear to catch it. "Thief!" Lord Edric shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Elira as she carried a stack of linens through the corridor. "This woman has been seen near my private chambers, and now a ring of considerable value has gone missing from my quarters." Elira froze, the linens nearly slipping from her arms, as a dozen startled faces turned toward her. "I have never entered your chambers, Lord Edric. I do not even know where they are located within this palace." "A convenient denial," Edric snapped, from a woman already proven capable of deception, before an entire court. The words landed like a blow, and Elira felt the weight of every watching eye pressing down upon her. She had expected suspicion to follow her after the throne room, but she had not expected it weaponized, so directly, so publicly, by a man who had orchestrated the very deception he now accused her of. Guards arrived quickly, summoned by the commotion, and Alira found herself escorted not gently this time, but firmly, toward a holding chamber near the palace's lower levels while the accusation was investigated. She sat alone in the small, cold room, her mind racing through every possible reason Lord Edric might choose this moment to strike against her. He fears what I know, she thought. He fears what the king and I have already uncovered, and this is his attempt to remove me, before I can uncover more. Hours passed before the door finally opened, and to her relief, it was Draven who entered, his expression tight with barely restrained anger. "This is fabricated," he said without preamble. "I have already questioned 3 servants who confirm you were nowhere near Lord Edric's private chambers at any point during the time frame he claims the ring disappeared." "Then why would he accuse me so publicly?" Alira asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. "Because a public accusation, if it succeeds, removes you from this investigation entirely," Draven said. "Banishment or imprisonment would silence you far more effectively than any threat delivered through an anonymous letter. He has grown desperate enough to act openly, rather than hide behind coded warnings." "Do you believe he acted alone in this?" Alira asked. "I believe he acted out of fear," Draven said. "Whether that fear stems from guilt over his own involvement, or simple panic at how close we have drawn to uncovering the truth, remains to be seen. Either way, I will not allow a fabricated accusation to remove you from this palace." Word of the accusation spread quickly through the court, and by the following morning, Alira found herself standing once more before the full assembly of nobles, though this time, not as a bride in borrowed silk, but as a maid accused of theft, facing a tribunal hastily assembled at Lord Edric's insistence. Edric stood before the gathered court, his composure regained, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to being believed. "This woman has already proven herself capable of standing before this very court, under false pretenses. Is it truly so difficult to believe she might also be capable of theft, when the opportunity presented itself?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the crowd, nobles eager to believe the simplest explanation, rather than confront the more troubling possibility that their own council harbored traitors. Alira felt the familiar tightening of fear in her chest, though this time, she refused to let it silence her. "I have never entered Lord Edric's private chambers," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, despite the trembling she fought to control. "I have 3 servants willing to confirm my location during the hours in question, and I would ask the court to consider why Lord Edric has chosen this particular moment, after weeks of investigation into Lady Priscilla's disappearance, to suddenly discover a missing ring and accuse the very witness assisting that investigation." A ripple of surprised murmuring moved through the crowd at her boldness, nobles exchanging uncertain glances. Edric's composure flickered, just slightly, before he recovered. "Are you suggesting I have fabricated this accusation?" he demanded. "I am suggesting the timing invites the question," Alira replied, holding his gaze steadily, despite every instinct urging her to look away. Before Edric could respond, the great doors of the hall opened, and Draven entered, his presence immediately commanding silence throughout the chamber. He walked directly to the raised platform where the tribunal had been assembled, his golden eyes sweeping over the gathered nobles, before settling on Lord Edric. "I have reviewed the testimonies of 3 servants who place Alira in the eastern laundry quarters throughout the entire time frame in question," Draven announced, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. "None of them place her anywhere near Lord Edric's private chambers." "Servants can be persuaded to lie, Your Majesty," Edric said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "They can," Draven agreed. "Just as councils can be persuaded to dress a frightened maid in a stolen bride's gown, and stewards can be persuaded to vanish before a scheme unfolds, and groundskeepers can be persuaded to disappear entirely once their usefulness ends. Persuasion, it seems, has been remarkably abundant throughout this entire affair, Lord Edric, and always in directions that happen to benefit whoever orchestrated it." The hall fell utterly silent, the implication of Draven's words settling over the gathered nobles like a physical weight. Edric's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence crumbling visibly beneath the king's steady, unrelenting gaze. "Your Majesty, I assure you, I have no connection to whatever has befallen my former steward or groundskeeper," Edric said, though his voice had begun to waver. Then perhaps you can explain, Draven said, why the accusation against Alira arrived so precisely at the moment our investigation began closing in on connections tied directly to your household. Edric had no answer, his mouth opening and closing several times without producing a single coherent defense. The gathered nobles watched, many exchanging glances that suggested the tide of public opinion had begun shifting rapidly away from the council lord and toward the maid he had so publicly accused. I find the accusation against Alira baseless, Draven announced finally, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. She will be released immediately, and this matter will be considered closed, unless further evidence emerges to suggest otherwise. Relief flooded through Alira so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled beneath her, though she forced herself to remain standing, aware of every eye still watching her closely. Edric said nothing further, his expression a mixture of fury and barely concealed panic, as the guards who had escorted Alira to the tribunal now stepped back, releasing her from their custody. As the court began to disperse, whispers rising once more into a low, uncertain murmur, Draven approached Alira directly, his expression softening slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "Are you well?" he asked quietly, low enough that only she could hear. "I am now," Alira admitted, her voice still unsteady. "Thank you for believing me." "I did not simply believe you," Draven said. "I confirmed the truth before allowing this tribunal to proceed. Belief alone would not have been enough to save you from Lord Edric's accusation, not when he clearly intended it to succeed." "Then what changed his plan?" Alira asked. "He underestimated how carefully I have been watching everyone connected to this conspiracy," Draven said, his golden eyes hardening, as he glanced toward where Edric still stood, pale and shaken, near the tribunal platform. "And he underestimated how unwilling I am to let a witness be silenced through fabricated accusations, particularly one who has proven more valuable to this investigation than his entire council combined." Alira felt a flush of warmth at his words, though the danger of the moment had not fully faded from her thoughts. "Do you believe he will attempt something else, now that this accusation has failed?" "I believe," Draven said grimly, "that a man cornered as thoroughly as Lord Edric now finds himself will either break entirely and confess whatever he knows, or grow more desperate and dangerous in his attempts to protect himself. I intend to be prepared for either possibility." As the hall continued emptying around them, Alira glanced once more toward Lord Edric, watching him retreat quickly through a side door, his earlier composure entirely abandoned. Whatever role he had played in the conspiracy against Lady Priscilla, it was clear now that his fear ran far deeper than mere concern over diplomatic consequences, and Alira suspected, with a growing certainty she could not fully explain, that the truth Draven sought was closer than either of them yet realized. That afternoon, Commander Yseult requested a private audience with Draven, and Alira was invited to join, a courtesy that would have been unthinkable only a week earlier. Yseult's expression was tight with barely contained urgency, as she laid a small, folded parchment on the table between them. "One of the servants questioned during the tribunal came to me afterward, in private," Yseult said. "She claims to have overheard Lord Edric speaking with someone in his study 2 nights past, though she could not identify the second voice clearly through the door." "What did she hear?" Draven asked. "Lord Edric pleading for more time," Yseult said, and the other voice, warning him that patience was running short, that the maid needed to be dealt with before she uncovered anything further. The servant fled before she could hear more, fearing discovery. Alira felt a chill settle over her at the confirmation that the accusation against her had indeed been deliberate, orchestrated specifically to remove her from the investigation before she learned too much. Then Lord Edric is not acting alone. Someone above him, or at least equal to him, is directing his actions. That would explain his desperation during the tribunal, Draven said. A man protecting only himself might have grown bold enough to insist on his innocence more forcefully. A man caught between his own guilt and someone else's expectations often crumbles far more easily, precisely as we witnessed today. "Did the servant recognize anything else about the second voice?" Alira asked. "An accent, a particular phrase, anything at all?" Yseult hesitated. "Only that the voice seemed accustomed to command, speaking with the kind of easy authority one does not often hear from ordinary household staff." "A noble then," Draven said, "or someone who has spent considerable time among them." comfortable enough with authority to intimidate even a council lord into obedience. Illyra's mind turned over every noble face she had encountered since the ordeal began, searching for someone whose authority might extend far enough to command Lord Edric's fearful compliance. Whoever this is, they clearly have influence significant enough to frighten a council lord into arranging a fabricated accusation against a witness they consider dangerous. Which means our next steps must be even more careful than before, Draven said. If Lord Edric is being directed by someone else, cornering him too aggressively risks alerting his true master before we have gathered enough evidence to hold either of them accountable. Isolde nodded in agreement. I will continue watching him closely, without revealing what we have learned. If he believes his accusation failed simply through misfortune, rather than deliberate investigation, he may attempt contact with his accomplice again, and this time, I intend to be watching for it. The plan settled between them, quiet and determined, and Illyra felt the familiar weight of the conspiracy pressing down upon her once more, heavier now, with the knowledge that Lord Edric answered to someone even more dangerous than himself. As the meeting concluded, and Isolde departed to arrange her surveillance, Draven lingered a moment longer, studying Illyra, with an expression of quiet concern. You handled yourself remarkably well before that tribunal, he said. Many nobles, accustomed to a lifetime of privilege, would have crumbled far more easily under such public accusation. I have spent 3 years learning to remain steady while invisible, Illyra said. Perhaps that taught me how to remain steady while accused as well. Draven's expression softened at that, something warm passing briefly behind his golden eyes. Then this palace has been wasting a considerable strength for far longer than anyone realized. Illyra found herself unable to hold back a small, tired smile at the compliment, the first genuine moment of lightness she had felt in days. I suppose I should thank Lord Edric then, for finally giving the court reason to notice me, even if his intentions were far from kind. A strange kind of gratitude, Draven said, a faint smile of his own touching the corner of his mouth, but not entirely undeserved, given how the tribunal turned against him rather than you. What happens to him now? Illyra asked. Will he face punishment for the false accusation, even if he is not yet proven guilty of the larger conspiracy? Not yet, Draven said, his expression sobering. If I move against him too swiftly for the false accusation alone, I risk losing whatever connection remains to the voice Isolde's informant overheard. It is a difficult balance, allowing a guilty man to remain free a while longer, in hope of uncovering a more dangerous one standing behind him. That seems a heavy burden to carry, Illyra said quietly, knowing a man is likely guilty, yet choosing patience over immediate justice. It is, Draven admitted, but justice delayed in service of uncovering the full truth is not justice abandoned. Lord Edric will answer for his actions eventually, whether alongside his unseen master or separately, once that connection is finally exposed. Illyra nodded, understanding the careful calculation behind his patience, even as it sat uneasily alongside her own instinct for swifter resolution. As the afternoon light shifted toward evening, beyond the tall windows of the council room, she found herself grateful, despite everything, that the investigation had not ended with her banishment, or worse. And grateful too for the quiet, steady presence of a king who had chosen to believe her when an entire court had been prepared to condemn her instead. A rider burst through the palace gates at dawn, his horse lathered white with exhaustion, shouting for the king before he had even dismounted. Illyra heard the commotion from her chamber and hurried toward the courtyard, arriving just as Draven emerged from the palace entrance, still fastening his coat, his expression sharp with alarm. The rider, one of the 3 sent north weeks earlier, nearly collapsed as he slid from his saddle. Your Majesty, he gasped, we found her, Lady Priscilla, alive, held in a hunting lodge near the northern border, guarded by 4 men. Relief and urgency crashed through Illyra in equal measure as she watched Draven's expression shift from alarm to fierce determination. Is she injured? He demanded. Frightened and weakened from confinement, but alive, the rider confirmed. Our lead scout is watching the lodge now, awaiting further orders before attempting anything that might endanger her. Assemble a company immediately, Draven ordered, turning to a nearby guard. I will lead them myself. Your Majesty, Commander Isolde said, arriving quickly at his side. Allow me to lead the retrieval. Your presence here, ensuring the council does not act while you are away, may be equally critical. Draven hesitated, clearly torn between the urge to personally ensure Lady Priscilla's safe return and the practical necessity of remaining to manage whatever might unfold within the palace during his absence. Finally he nodded, though reluctance was evident in the tightness of his jaw. "Take enough men to overwhelm them without unnecessary conflict," he said. "Lady Priscilla's safety takes priority above all else. If her captors resist, subdue them, but I want at least one alive for questioning." Iseult nodded and departed swiftly to assemble her company, leaving Draven and Alira standing together in the courtyard, as the palace stirred to life around them, with the news slowly spreading among the staff and nobles alike. "This changes everything," Alira said quietly. "It does," Draven agreed. "Once she is safely returned, her testimony may reveal exactly who orchestrated her captivity, and why. It may finally give us the proof needed to move openly against whoever has been directing Lord Edric's actions." The day passed with agonizing slowness, every hour stretching longer than the last, as Alira waited alongside Draven for word from the northern road. She found herself pulled into the rhythm of the palace's uneasy anticipation, nobles and servants alike whispering in corners, speculation spreading faster than any official announcement could contain it. Word finally arrived, as evening settled over the palace, a rider approaching at a hard gallop, his face alight with the particular relief of good news long awaited. Draven met him at the gate personally, Alira close behind. "She is safe, Your Majesty," the rider announced. "Commander Iseult's company overwhelmed the guards with minimal resistance. Lady Priscilla is exhausted and weak, but otherwise unharmed. They should arrive at the palace within the hour." A collective breath seemed to release throughout the assembled crowd, relief spreading visibly among the nobles and servants who had gathered to await news. Draven's shoulders eased slightly, though his expression remained sharp with purpose. "Prepare the physician's quarters," he ordered, "and ensure Lady Priscilla is given privacy and comfort the moment she arrives. Whatever she has endured these past weeks, she deserves gentleness now, not another crowd of curious eyes." The hour passed slowly, and finally, as darkness settled fully over the palace, the sound of approaching horses announced Commander Iseult's return. Alira watched from a respectful distance as a carriage rolled through the gates, and moments later, a young woman was helped down from within, pale and thin, her once elegant traveling dress now torn and stained, but her eyes alert despite the visible exhaustion carried in every line of her posture. Lady Priscilla Hartwell looked nothing like Alira had imagined during the weeks of investigation, no haughty noblewoman accustomed to privilege, but a frightened young woman who flinched slightly at the crowd gathered to receive her, before her gaze found Draven and steadied. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice hoarse but composed, "I owe you a debt I cannot easily repay." "You owe me nothing," Draven said gently, an unexpected softness entering his tone that Alira had not heard directed at anyone else since the investigation began. "You have endured enough without carrying debts as well. Rest first. We will speak once you have recovered." Priscilla nodded, though her eyes moved past Draven, settling on Alira with sudden recognition. "You are the maid who wore my gown," she said quietly. Alira felt a flush of uncertainty at being addressed directly. "Yes, my lady. I am sorry for the circumstance that led to it." "Do not apologize," Priscilla said, surprising her. "I heard, even in captivity, that you refused to let the deception stand once the king questioned you. My captors were furious when word reached them of what had happened in that hall. They had expected the substitution to hold long enough to complete the binding before anyone noticed." Alira absorbed this, understanding for the first time just how deliberately the entire scheme had been designed to succeed through her silence, and how thoroughly her refusal to maintain the lie had disrupted it. "Do you know who held you captive, my lady? Who arranged all of this?" Priscilla's expression darkened, exhaustion warring with lingering fear. "I never saw the man who ordered my captivity directly, only the guards who kept me confined. But I overheard enough, in whispered conversations meant to remain private, to know the plan was never simply to remove me from the ceremony." "What was the plan then?" Draven asked, his voice sharpening with renewed urgency, despite his earlier insistence on allowing her rest. Priscilla glanced between Draven and Alira, weighing whether to continue despite her obvious exhaustion. They intended to use the substitute bride, whoever she turned out to be, as a puppet queen, someone without family or influence to protect her. easily controlled once bound to the throne. I believe they expected you would not notice the deception at all, Your Majesty, and that once the binding was complete, they would find ways to influence you through whichever woman occupied that role. The revelation landed heavily over the small gathering, and Alira felt a cold understanding settle into place. She had not simply been a convenient substitute chosen in a moment of panic. She had been selected, deliberately, as someone without power or connections, someone easily manipulated once bound permanently to a king, who would have no reason to suspect her loyalty divided. They chose me because I would have no protection against them, Alira said slowly, the full weight of the conspiracy finally becoming clear. A puppet queen, controlled through threats or coercion, married to a king who trusted her, without realizing her compliance, had been engineered from the very beginning. Yes, Priscilla confirmed grimly, though it seems, from what I have heard, that you proved far less controllable than they anticipated. Draven's expression had grown darker with every word, his golden eyes fixed on some distant point as the full scope of the scheme settled into place within his mind. Then this was never simply about removing an alliance between packs, he said. It was about installing influence directly upon my throne, through a queen they believed they could control entirely. Yes, Priscilla said. And I believe, though I cannot yet prove it, that the man directing this scheme holds a position close enough to the throne to benefit significantly from such control, should it have succeeded. The implication hung heavily in the evening air, and Alira felt Draven's gaze shift toward her, something fierce and protective settling behind his golden eyes. They underestimated her, he said quietly, almost to himself. They believed a maid pulled from obscurity would be too frightened, too powerless, to resist manipulation. Instead, she exposed their scheme, in front of the entire court, within the first hour of its execution. A miscalculation they will not easily recover from, Priscilla said, a faint, exhausted smile touching her lips despite everything she had endured. I am grateful, truly, that they chose someone who refused to play the role they assigned her. As guards helped Priscilla toward the physician's quarters for much-needed rest and care, Draven remained standing in the courtyard, his expression unreadable, as he processed the full weight of what had just been revealed. Alira stood beside him, feeling the conspiracy's true shape finally coming into focus, more dangerous and more personal than either of them had first suspected. We are close now, Draven said finally, his voice low and resolute. Whoever orchestrated this believed they could install a controlled queen upon my throne, through fear and manipulation. They will not simply retreat now that their plan has failed. They will grow more desperate and more dangerous, and I intend to be ready when they finally reveal themselves. Commander Ysault approached then, her expression grim despite the successful rescue. Your Majesty, one of the guards from the hunting lodge survived capture. He is being held for questioning, though he has said little so far. Bring him to the council chamber at first light, Draven said. I want to know everything he can tell us, no matter how small the detail. There is something else, Ysault added. Among the guard's belongings, we found a ledger, partially burned, as though someone attempted to destroy it before we arrived. What remains of the pages references payments made over several months, though the names are mostly illegible now. Mostly, Draven repeated, catching the careful emphasis in her word choice. One name survived the fire intact, Ysault confirmed. A payment recorded 3 months past, to a household steward named Corvin Ashgrove. Alira felt the pieces shifting once more into a clearer, more damning shape. Then the payments to Corvin began well before Lady Priscilla's disappearance, exactly as we suspected. This was planned for months, not decided in a single desperate night. Yes, Draven said, taking the charred ledger fragment from Ysault and studying it closely in the torchlight. And if payments were being made for months, there must be a source of funds significant enough to sustain such an operation without drawing attention. That is not the resource of a minor household steward acting alone. A wealthy patron then, Alira said. Someone with resources enough to fund a scheme spanning months, involving a steward, a groundskeeper, hired guards, and a hidden lodge near the northern border. Precisely, Draven said, his expression hardening with renewed determination. And resources of that scale narrow the list of suspects considerably. There are only a handful of individuals within this kingdom, wealthy enough to sustain such an operation, without their own finances showing signs of strain. Discreetly, Draven said, If word spreads that I am examining the finances of the kingdom's wealthiest families, whoever is responsible will have ample warning to hide their tracks further. I will need someone trusted, someone capable of reviewing such records without drawing suspicion. He glanced at Alira, and she understood immediately what he intended to ask before he spoke the words aloud. I have never reviewed financial records in my life, she said, though she felt a flicker of the same determination that had carried her through the throne room weeks earlier. But I am willing to learn, if it brings us closer to ending this. I would not ask it of you if I believed there were a safer path forward, Draven said, something apologetic entering his tone. But you have proven, again and again, that you notice details others overlook. That skill may prove as valuable in a ledger as it has in a council chamber. Alira nodded, accepting the task despite the uncertainty it carried. As the courtyard finally quieted, guards dispersing to their posts, and servants retreating to their beds, she found herself standing once more beside Draven, beneath the darkened sky, the weight of the conspiracy pressing closer than ever. Yet somehow, standing beside him, feeling less alone in carrying it than she had at any point since the ordeal began. Start with the ledgers belonging to the families closest to the council, Draven said quietly. Those with seats of influence but without direct royal oversight of their finances. It is a place to begin, even if it does not immediately reveal the truth we seek. And if I find nothing? Alira asked. Then we widen the search, Draven said. Conspiracies of this scale rarely hide their traces completely. Somewhere, in some ledger or shipment record, or quiet transaction, there will be a thread. It is simply a matter of patience and careful eyes to find it. You make it sound almost simple, Alira said, a faint, tired smile touching her lips, despite the exhaustion of the long day. It is rarely simple, Draven admitted, a matching smile briefly softening his own composed features. But it is rarely as complicated as those responsible hope it will be either. Every scheme leaves traces, no matter how carefully constructed. Ours is simply to find them before more harm is done. Alira nodded, drawing a measure of quiet strength from his steady confidence. Then tomorrow, I will begin with the ledgers, and you will question the surviving guard. Together, Draven said, we will find whoever believed they could use fear and manipulation to claim influence over this throne, and we will ensure they regret ever believing a maid in a borrowed gown would be too powerless to stop them. The words settled over Alira with quiet, fierce comfort, and as she finally retreated toward her chamber that night, the moon casting pale light over the palace's darkened towers, she allowed herself a small measure of hope that the truth, however dangerous it proved to uncover, was finally within their reach. The ledger page tore as Alira's trembling hands turned it too quickly, and she froze, staring at the name written plainly across the faded ink. She had spent 3 days buried in dusty financial records within a small archive room, cross-referencing shipments, payments, and household accounts, until her eyes ached, and her fingers were stained with old ink. She had nearly given up hope of finding anything useful among the tedious columns of numbers, until this single entry stopped her cold. A payment, recorded 8 months earlier, from the private accounts of Lord Callum Ashworth, one of the wealthiest nobles in the kingdom and a longtime member of the king's inner council, to a name she now recognized immediately, Corvin Ashgrove. Alira sat back, her heart pounding, understanding the implications settling over her with dizzying speed. Lord Ashworth had always presented himself as one of Draven's most loyal advisors, soft-spoken and deferential, rarely drawing attention to himself during council meetings. She had barely noticed him during her weeks at court, precisely because he seemed so unremarkable compared to the louder, more ambitious voices around him. That, she realized with sudden clarity, was exactly the point. She gathered the ledger and several supporting documents quickly, hurrying through the palace corridors toward the council chamber, where she knew Draven would be reviewing testimony from the captured guard. She burst through the door without waiting for permission, drawing startled looks from both Draven and Commander Ysault. Lord Ashworth, she said breathlessly, placing the ledger before them. Payments to Corvin Ashgrove, beginning 8 months ago, long before Lady Priscilla's disappearance was ever planned. Draven's expression shifted rapidly, from surprise to grim recognition, as he studied the documents she had brought. Ashworth, he repeated slowly. He has sat on my council for over a decade. I have never once suspected him of ambition beyond his current position. That may be precisely why he was never suspected, Ysault said, studying the ledger with narrowed eyes. A man who appears content with modest influence draws far less scrutiny than one who openly seeks more power. There is more, Elira said, producing additional pages she had found buried within the archives. Records of a substantial loan, taken against Ashworth's estate roughly 2 years ago, far larger than his household expenses would typically require. I believe this loan funded the entire scheme, the payments to Corvin, the guards at the hunting lodge, likely even whatever coin was used to silence the groundskeeper. Draven studied the numbers carefully, his jaw tightening with every line he read. This confirms resources significant enough to sustain months of careful planning. But why would Ashworth risk everything for a scheme this dangerous? He already holds considerable influence within my council. Perhaps considerable influence was no longer enough, Yseult suggested. Ambition rarely satisfies itself with what it already possesses. A guard entered then, interrupting the discussion, his expression tense. Your Majesty, the surviving guard from the hunting lodge has finally agreed to speak, but only if granted leniency for his cooperation. Draven exchanged a glance with Yseult before nodding. Bring him. The guard, a rough-looking man with a bandaged shoulder from the earlier confrontation at the lodge, was brought before them, his expression wary but resigned. I will tell you what I know, he said, in exchange for my life being spared. Speak the truth, and I will consider it, Draven said, his tone leaving no room for further negotiation. The guard swallowed hard before continuing. I was hired through an intermediary, a man who never gave his true name, only instructions and coin. But once, during a delivery of supplies to the lodge, I saw him meet directly with the man giving the orders. It was Lord Ashworth himself, dressed plainly, clearly attempting to avoid recognition, but I had seen him before, at a distance, during a visit to the palace grounds. You are certain, Draven said, his voice deceptively calm, despite the fury Elira could sense building beneath it. As certain as a man can be, the guard confirmed. He spoke of the binding ceremony failing, of the substitute bride needing to remain compliant until she could be properly controlled. He spoke of Lady Priscilla as leverage, insurance against interference from her family's pack, until she was no longer needed. The confirmation settled the last uncertainty from Elira's mind, though a cold anger replaced it just as quickly. Lord Ashworth had orchestrated everything, from Lady Priscilla's abduction to her own forced substitution, viewing them both as nothing more than pieces, to be arranged and discarded, according to his ambition. Why? Draven demanded. What did he hope to gain from placing a controlled bride upon my throne? The guard hesitated, glancing nervously between the assembled faces before answering. I heard him speak once of influence beyond the council, of shaping decisions that a compliant queen might sway more easily than a stubborn king. He spoke of expanding his family's holdings, of securing trade agreements that had previously been denied to him. Greed, Yseult said flatly. Nothing more complicated than simple greed, dressed up in the language of ambition. Greed capable of orchestrating the abduction of a noblewoman, the corruption of a household steward, the disappearance of a groundskeeper, and the manipulation of an entire court, Draven said, his voice cold with barely restrained fury. This ends now. He turned to Yseult immediately. Arrest Lord Ashworth, quietly, if possible, though I doubt he will submit without resistance once he realizes his scheme has unraveled. Yseult nodded and departed swiftly, gathering a small contingent of trusted guards, before moving through the palace toward Ashworth's private chambers. Elira remained with Draven, the tension of waiting settling heavily over the council room once more. You found this, Draven said quietly, studying her with an expression she had come to recognize. Respect mingled with something warmer he no longer seemed to be hiding, buried within ledgers that everyone else overlooked. I had 3 days and very little else to occupy my attention, Elira said, though she could not entirely dismiss the pride swelling within her at his acknowledgement. You uncovered what an entire council failed to notice for months, Draven said. This palace has severely underestimated you, Elira, and I intend to ensure that mistake is never repeated. Before she could respond, shouting erupted from somewhere within the palace, followed by the unmistakable clash of steel against steel. Draven was moving before the sound had fully registered, drawing the blade at his side as he rushed from the council room with Elira close behind, despite the danger. They reached the corridor leading to Ashworth's private chambers just as Yseult's guards subdued a struggling figure, Lord Ashworth himself, his composed exterior finally shattered, his face twisted with fury and desperation as he was forced to his knees before the approaching king. "You cannot prove any of this," Ashworth spat, though the venom in his voice carried an unmistakable edge of panic. "A ledger, a frightened guard's testimony, nothing more than circumstantial fragments." "A guard who witnessed you personally at the hunting lodge, where Lady Priscilla was held captive," Draven said, his voice dangerously quiet. "A ledger, documenting payments to your co-conspirators, months before her disappearance. A loan against your estate large enough to fund an operation spanning nearly a year. I believe, Lord Ashworth, that the evidence against you is considerably more than circumstantial." Ashworth's fury faltered, replaced briefly by something closer to panic, before he regained a measure of his earlier composure. "Whatever I have done, I did for the good of this kingdom, to prevent it from being weakened by an alliance that would have shifted power too heavily toward the Hartwell pack." "You did it for yourself," Draven said, his voice carrying through the corridor with unmistakable finality. "You abducted an innocent woman, corrupted your own household, likely arranged the disappearance of a groundskeeper who threatened to expose you, and attempted to install a controlled queen upon my throne, through fear and manipulation. There is no version of this kingdom's good that justifies such cruelty." Ashworth said nothing further, his silence itself a confirmation of everything they had uncovered. Draven turned to Yseult. "Take him to the dungeons. He will face full judgment before the court, once Lady Priscilla has recovered enough to provide her own testimony." As the guards led Ashworth away, his earlier bluster reduced to sullen silence, Draven turned to Alira, the tension of the confrontation slowly draining from his shoulders. "It is over," he said quietly, though something in his tone suggested he did not entirely believe the danger had fully passed. "Is it?" Alira asked. "The scheme is uncovered, its architect captured," Draven said, "but the consequences of what he attempted, and what it revealed about the vulnerabilities within my own court, will take considerably longer to fully address." Alira nodded, understanding the weight still resting upon him, despite the victory they had achieved. Yet standing beside him in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, she felt something she had not expected to feel throughout this entire ordeal. A quiet, steady sense that whatever challenges remained, she would face them not as an overlooked maid pulled unwillingly into a scheme beyond her control, but as someone whose courage and sharp mind had helped bring a dangerous conspiracy to its long overdue end. Word of Lord Ashworth's arrest spread through the palace faster than any official announcement could contain it, and by evening, the entire court buzzed with disbelief and speculation. Nobles who had once greeted Ashworth with respectful deference now spoke of him in hushed, scandalized tones, some claiming they had always sensed something calculating behind his quiet demeanor, others simply stunned that such treachery had gone unnoticed for so long within their own ranks. Lady Meredith, released from suspicion once Ashworth's guilt became clear, sought Alira out that evening, her expression carrying a genuine relief that had been absent during their earlier, tenser exchanges. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I doubted whether my own fear had made me complicit in something far worse than I understood at the time. Learning that Ashworth orchestrated everything, using intermediaries even I never suspected, has eased a burden I have carried since that first frightening morning." "You were as much a piece moved by his scheme as I was," Alira said, finding she held no anger toward the older woman, now that the truth had fully surfaced. "None of us chose the roles we were forced into that day." "No," Meredith agreed, "though you, unlike the rest of us, refused to remain quietly within the role assigned to you. I do not think this kingdom fully understands yet what it owes to that refusal." Later, as the palace finally settled into a quieter rhythm following the day's dramatic revelations, Alira found Draven once more near the same window overlooking the gardens where they had spoken so candidly once before. He looked exhausted, the weight of the day's events evident in the tired set of his shoulders, though something steadier had settled over him now that the architect of the conspiracy finally sat within his dungeons rather than moving freely through his court. "Lady Priscilla will be well enough to provide her testimony within a few days," he said, without turning from the window. "Once she has spoken before the court, Ashworth's fate will be sealed beyond any further doubt." "And after that?" Alira asked. Draven finally turned to look at her, something unreadable passing behind his golden eyes. "After that, I suppose I must consider what becomes of a kingdom that so nearly allowed a controlled queen to be forced upon its throne through fear and manipulation." And what becomes of the maid whose courage prevented it from succeeding? Elira felt her breath catch slightly at the weight carried in his words, uncertain exactly what he intended by them, though something in his steady gaze suggested the question was not merely rhetorical. She did not press him further that evening, sensing the exhaustion of the day still weighed too heavily for such conversations to reach their natural conclusion. But as she finally retired to her chamber that night, she carried with her the quiet, persistent sense that whatever came next for the kingdom, and for herself, would look nothing like the invisible existence she had known before a stolen bride's gown had been forced upon her shoulders. Sleep came more easily that night than it had in weeks, the absence of immediate danger allowing her mind, for the first time since the ordeal began, to rest without circling endlessly through threats and suspicions. Yet even as she drifted toward sleep, she found herself returning to Draven's unfinished question, turning it over with a curiosity she could not quite suppress. What becomes of the maid whose courage prevented it from succeeding? She did not know what answer he intended, nor what shape the coming days would take now that the conspiracy's architect sat confined within the palace dungeons, rather than moving freely among the council he had so thoroughly deceived. But she understood, with a clarity that had grown steadily since that first terrifying moment in the throne room, that she was no longer the same frightened maid who had been pulled from the laundry room without explanation. Whatever the kingdom decided to make of her role in uncovering Lord Ashworth's treachery, she intended to face it standing tall, exactly as she had learned to do throughout every trial this conspiracy had thrown against her. Outside her window, the palace settled into rare quiet, guards resuming their ordinary rounds rather than urgent searches, servants speaking again of mundane matters rather than frightened whispers of abduction and betrayal. For the first time in weeks, the palace felt, however briefly, like a place at peace, and Elira allowed herself to hope that whatever remained to be resolved, the worst of the danger had finally passed. The court fell utterly silent as Lady Priscilla Hartwell walked into the grand hall, her steps steady, despite the lingering pale exhaustion still visible in her face. Elira watched from the side of the chamber, her heart pounding, as Priscilla approached the raised platform, where Draven waited alongside a panel of senior nobles, assembled to hear her formal testimony. Lord Ashworth stood below, flanked by guards, his wrists bound, his once composed expression now hollow, with the particular fear of a man who understood his fate had already been decided in every way that mattered. "Tell the court what you told me privately," Draven said gently, "exactly as it happened." Priscilla's voice, though still hoarse from her ordeal, carried clearly through the silent hall as she recounted her abduction from her own chamber weeks earlier, the men who had drugged and carried her away in the dead of night, the long weeks of confinement at the hunting lodge, and the voice she had overheard discussing plans to use her as leverage, while a controlled substitute took her place at the ceremony. "I heard him," she said finally, turning to point directly at Lord Ashworth, speaking with the guards who held me. "He spoke of patience, of waiting until the substitute bride had been properly bound, before revealing my continued survival, as insurance against any resistance from my family's pack." Gasps rippled through the assembled nobles, many turning to stare at Ashworth with open horror and disbelief. He said nothing, his earlier defiance entirely extinguished, replaced by the quiet resignation of a man who understood no further denial would serve him. "Lord Ashworth," Draven said, his voice carrying the full authority of the throne, "you stand accused of the abduction of Lady Priscilla Hartwell, the corruption of your own household staff, the likely disappearance and possible harm of a groundskeeper who threatened to expose your scheme, and the attempted manipulation of the royal binding ceremony through deception and coercion. How do you answer these charges?" Ashworth remained silent for a long moment, his gaze flickering briefly toward Elira, before settling back on the king. "I sought only to protect this kingdom's interests," he said finally, though his voice carried none of the earlier conviction. "The alliance with the Hartwell pack would have shifted power in ways I believed dangerous to our stability." "You sought to protect your own ambition," Draven said flatly. "Nothing more noble than that. You are found guilty of every charge brought before this court, based on the testimony of Lady Priscilla, the physical evidence recovered from your own financial records, and the confession of your hired accomplice. You will be stripped of your title, your lands seized by the crown, and you will spend the remainder of your life confined, far from any position where your ambition might again endanger innocent lives." The verdict landed with the finality of a closing door, and Ashworth was led away without further protest, his defeat complete in every visible way. The assembled nobles began murmuring among themselves, the shock of the revelation still settling over the court, as guards escorted the fallen lord from the hall. Draven turned then to address the remaining assembly, his expression shifting from the cold authority of judgment to something more measured and deliberate. This conspiracy revealed vulnerabilities within my own court that I intend to address thoroughly in the coming months. But it also revealed something else, something this court owes a considerable debt to acknowledge. Alira felt her stomach tighten as every eye in the hall began turning toward her, understanding suddenly that Draven intended to speak of her role before the entire gathered nobility. When Lord Ashworth's scheme placed an unwilling maid before this court, in a stolen bride's gown, Draven continued, he believed he had found someone powerless enough to be controlled without resistance. He believed fear and obscurity would ensure her silence. He was wrong. The hall remained utterly silent, hanging on every word, as Draven continued, his golden eyes finding Alira's across the length of the chamber. Alira refused to let a lie stand, even when doing so placed her own safety at considerable risk. She uncovered evidence that an entire council failed to notice for months. She endured a fabricated accusation designed specifically to remove her from this investigation, and she stood before this very court and refused to be silenced by it. Whatever debt this kingdom owes for the safe return of Lady Priscilla Hartwell, and for the exposure of a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of this throne, it owes in no small part to her courage. Alira felt heat rising to her face under the weight of so many watching eyes, uncertain how to respond to such public acknowledgement after weeks of being treated as a suspect, a witness, or simply an inconvenience to be managed. Priscilla, standing nearby, offered her a small, genuine smile of solidarity that eased some of the discomfort settling over her. After the formal proceedings concluded and the hall slowly began to empty, Draven approached Alira directly, something in his expression softer and more private than the authority he had carried throughout the trial. You did not have to say all of that before the entire court, Alira said quietly, once they stood far enough from curious ears. I did, Draven said. This kingdom needed to understand exactly what nearly happened, and exactly who prevented it. Silence about your role would have served no one, least of all you. What happens now? Alira asked, the question carrying more weight than the simple words suggested. Draven was quiet for a long moment, studying her, with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite the exhaustion of the day's events. I have spent these past weeks investigating a conspiracy that attempted to force a controlled bride upon my throne, through fear and manipulation, he said slowly. In doing so, I found myself working alongside a woman who refused every expectation placed upon her, who spoke truth when silence would have been easier, who noticed details an entire council overlooked, and who faced danger repeatedly, without ever once asking to be spared from it. Alira's breath caught at the direction his words were taking, uncertain whether to hope for what she suspected he might say next. I refused the binding ceremony that morning because it was built upon a lie, Draven continued, his voice low and steady. Not because the woman standing before me lacked worth. I want you to understand that distinction clearly, Alira, because it matters a great deal to what I intend to say next. What do you intend to say? Alira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That my refusal was never a rejection of you, Draven said. It was a rejection of the deception forced upon both of us that morning. And now that the truth has been fully uncovered, now that the conspiracy has been dismantled and its architect brought to justice, I find I do not wish to release you from my side, not out of obligation or political necessity, but because these weeks spent working alongside you have shown me something I did not expect to find within these palace walls. Alira felt her heart racing, scarcely able to believe the direction of his words after everything they had endured together. And what is that? Someone I trust completely, Draven said simply, and someone I have come, against every expectation I carried into that throne room weeks ago, to care for deeply. The words settled over Alira with a warmth that eclipsed the exhaustion and fear of the past weeks entirely, and she found herself, for the first time since a guard had pulled her unceremoniously from the laundry room, unable to find words adequate to the moment. She simply looked at him, this king who had refused a lie, and, in refusing it, had somehow found his way toward a truth neither of them had expected to discover. I do not know what to say, she admitted finally. You do not need to say anything tonight, Draven said, a rare, genuine smile touching his composed features. There will be time enough for that conversation, once this kingdom has fully recovered from the conspiracy that nearly reshaped its throne through fear, rather than truth. For now, simply know that whatever comes next, I do not intend to let you return to the obscurity this palace once kept you within. In the days that followed, the palace slowly settled into a new rhythm, the shock of Ashworth's betrayal giving way to a careful, deliberate rebuilding of trust throughout the council. Lord Edric, though shaken and humbled by his own role in the deception, was permitted to remain on the council under close watch. His cooperation in the final days of the investigation weighed against his earlier complicity. Lady Meredith resumed her duties with a quiet gratitude that had replaced her earlier fear entirely. Lady Priscilla, once she had regained her strength, requested a private audience with Elira before returning to her own family's estate to recover fully among those who loved her. They met in a small garden courtyard, away from the curious eyes of the court, the late afternoon sun casting soft light over the blooming hedges. I wanted to thank you properly, Priscilla said, away from the formality of the court. What you did, refusing to let their lie stand even when it endangered you directly, gave me hope during the darkest weeks of my captivity. Word of it reached even the guards who held me, and I clung to the thought that someone within that palace refused to be controlled. I only spoke the truth, Elira said. I do not know that it required the courage everyone insists on crediting me with. Perhaps that is exactly why it required such courage, Priscilla said gently. The truth is rarely comfortable to speak when silence would serve you better. You spoke it anyway, at considerable risk to yourself, for a stranger you had never met. That is no small thing, Elira, whatever modesty you wish to attach to it. Elira considered this, watching the late sunlight filter through the garden's blooming branches. What will you do now, my lady? Will you return to your family's pack? For a time, Priscilla said, though I confess, after everything that has happened, I find myself uncertain whether I wish to return to the life of arranged bindings and political alliances that nearly cost me everything. Perhaps there is wisdom in choosing one's own path, rather than accepting whatever role, ambition, and circumstance assign to us. A wisdom I have only recently begun to understand myself, Elira admitted, thinking of the strange, unexpected turn her own life had taken since that terrifying morning in the laundry room. Priscilla smiled, a genuine warmth finally reaching her tired eyes. Then perhaps we have both learned something valuable from this ordeal, however painful the lessons proved to be in the learning of them. They parted that afternoon with a quiet mutual respect that Elira suspected would remain long after Priscilla's carriage disappeared down the palace's long approach road, carrying her home to a family who had feared, for many long weeks, that they might never see her again. That evening, Draven found Elira in the same garden courtyard, the last light of day fading gently behind the palace towers. He carried none of the formal weight he had held during the trial, only a quiet, thoughtful ease that had become more familiar to her over the past weeks than she ever expected a king's presence could feel. Lady Priscilla spoke well of you before she departed, he said, settling onto the stone bench beside her. She was generous with her praise, Elira said. I only did what seemed right at the time. I never imagined it would unravel into everything that followed. Few acts of courage announce their full consequences in advance, Draven said. That is often what makes them courage, rather than simple calculation. Elira glanced at him, studying the way the fading light softened the sharp lines of his face, the golden eyes that had once studied her with suspicion, now holding something far gentler. You have changed since that morning in the throne room, she observed. You seemed so certain then, so unshakable in your authority. I did not expect to see this side of you, uncertain enough to sit quietly in a garden rather than issue commands. Authority and certainty are not always the same thing, Draven said. I have spent years learning to project the first, even when I have not always possessed the second. This conspiracy tested both in ways I did not anticipate when I first took this throne. And yet you saw through Lord Ashworth's scheme within moments, in front of the entire court, Elira said. That did not seem uncertain to me at all. Recognizing deception is different from knowing what to do once it is exposed, Draven said. I knew you were not Lady Priscilla the moment you crossed that threshold. I did not know, in that instant, what would become of the maid standing in her place. Nor did I expect that Maid would prove instrumental in dismantling a conspiracy that had been building against my throne for the better part of a year. Elira considered this, the weight of everything they had endured together settling into a strange, comfortable quiet between them. I still find it difficult to believe how much has changed since that morning. 3 years I spent in this palace, entirely unnoticed, and then a single gown changed everything. Not the gown, Draven said quietly. The choice you made once you were forced to wear it. Many in your position would have let the lie stand, would have hoped silence carried them safely through the ceremony and beyond. You chose differently, and that choice has shaped everything that followed. The stars had begun to emerge fully overhead by the time their conversation quieted into comfortable silence, neither feeling the need to fill it with further words. Elira found herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, simply content in the present moment, free from the immediate fear and urgency that had defined so much of the preceding weeks. Tomorrow would bring its own considerations, questions of what her new position within the palace might look like, how the court might continue adjusting to a maid who had proven herself far more capable than anyone had ever expected. But for this quiet evening, sitting beside a king who had chosen truth over convenience, and had somehow, in the process, found his way toward genuine affection for the woman who helped him uncover it, Elira allowed herself simply to breathe, and to hope, for the first time in weeks, that whatever came next might finally bring something resembling peace. Bells rang across the palace grounds before the sun had fully cleared the eastern towers, and Elira woke to the sound with her heart already racing before she remembered why. Today, after weeks of investigation, judgment, and quiet recovery, the binding ceremony would finally proceed, though nothing about it would resemble the frightened, hurried deception that had begun this entire ordeal. This time, there would be no borrowed gown pinned hastily by trembling hands, no council members whispering desperate instructions in a curtained chamber, no lie waiting to be exposed before an unsuspecting court. Lady Meredith arrived shortly after dawn, carrying a gown of Elira's own, commissioned specifically for this day, rather than salvaged from another woman's abandoned wardrobe. The older woman's hands, once trembling with fear during their first meeting, now moved with steady, genuine care as she helped Elira dress. "You look nothing like the frightened maid I dressed weeks ago," Meredith observed, adjusting the delicate embroidery along the gown's sleeve. "I do not feel like her either," Elira admitted, studying her reflection in the tall mirror before her. The gown was simpler than the elaborate silk she had worn during that first deceptive ceremony, but it felt more truly hers, chosen rather than forced upon her. "The king has requested to see you before the ceremony begins," Meredith said once the final adjustments were complete. "He is waiting in the garden courtyard." Elira made her way through the palace corridors, nodding to servants and guards, who greeted her now with genuine warmth, rather than the wary curiosity that had followed her during those first frightening weeks. She found Draven waiting exactly where Meredith had said, dressed in formal black and silver, though he had forgone the elaborate ceremonial robes typically reserved for such occasions. "You look beautiful," he said simply, as she approached. "You look nervous," Elira replied, noticing the slight tension carried in his shoulders despite his composed exterior. "Perhaps I am," Draven admitted, a faint smile touching his mouth. "The last time I stood before this court for a binding ceremony, it unraveled into chaos within moments. I find myself hoping today proceeds rather differently." "It will," Elira said, with more certainty than she entirely felt herself. "There is no lie to uncover this time." Draven reached for her hand, his fingers closing gently around hers. "I wanted to speak with you once more, before we walked into that hall, to be certain you still wish to proceed. I would never force this upon you, Elira, regardless of what the court or the council might expect." "I know," Elira said softly, "and I choose this, not because circumstance forced a gown upon me weeks ago, but because these past weeks have shown me exactly who you are, and exactly what I want, for the first time in my life, entirely for myself." Something fierce and grateful passed behind Draven's golden eyes, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet garden holding the weight of everything that had brought them to this point. The walk to the throne room felt entirely different this time, Elira's steps steady rather than trembling, her chin lifted, not out of desperate necessity, but out of genuine confidence in the choice she was making. The great doors opened before her, and the assembled court turned as one to watch her enter, their expressions carrying none of the suspicious murmuring that had greeted her weeks earlier, but instead a respectful, curious warmth that had grown steadily since Ashworth's conspiracy had been fully exposed. Lady Priscilla, who had returned specifically for this occasion, offered Elira a warm, encouraging smile from her seat among the honored guests. Lord Edric, humbled and quiet since the trial, watched from his place on the council, with an expression of genuine relief, rather than his earlier scheming anxiety. Commander Yseult stood near the dais, her posture as sharp and watchful as ever, though her eyes carried unmistakable approval as Elira passed. Draven waited at the base of the dais, exactly as he had weeks before, though everything about this moment felt entirely transformed. When Elira reached him, he took both her hands in his golden eyes steady and unwavering. "Weeks ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "I stood in this same hall and refused a binding built upon deception. I refused it not because the woman before me lacked worth, but because I would not allow a lie to determine the future of this throne, nor the future of the woman standing within it." The court listened in rapt silence, every noble present understanding the significance of the moment unfolding before them. "Today," Draven continued, "I stand before this same hall to complete a binding, built upon truth, courage, and a choice made freely by both of us. Elira did not seek this throne. She was forced into a role she never asked for, and in refusing to let a lie stand, she uncovered a conspiracy that threatened this kingdom's very foundation. She faced false accusation, danger, and uncertainty without ever once asking to be spared from it, and in doing so, she has proven herself worthy of standing beside me, not through birth or circumstance, but through character, earned in the most difficult of trials." Elira felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though she held them back, meeting Draven's steady gaze with equal resolve. "I came to this palace 3 years ago, as an invisible girl scrubbing floors no one thought to notice," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the emotion tightening her throat. "I never imagined I would stand here today, chosen not as a substitute for someone else's fate, but as myself, entirely and completely. Whatever comes next for this kingdom, I intend to meet it honestly, exactly as I have tried to do since the moment I refused to let a lie stand in this very hall." The ceremony proceeded then, the ancient words of binding spoken clearly and without hesitation, sealing a union built on nothing but truth and mutual choice. When Draven finally placed the delicate circlet upon Elira's brow, marking her formally as queen, the assembled court erupted into applause that carried genuine warmth, rather than the polite obligation such ceremonies often demanded. Afterward, as the celebration spilled into the palace's grand hall, nobles and servants mingling in a rare display of unified goodwill, Elira found herself standing once more beside Draven, near the same tall windows where they had shared so many quiet, difficult conversations throughout the preceding weeks. "Any regrets?" Draven asked quietly, watching the celebration unfold around them. "None," Elira said, and meant it fully. "Though I confess, I never imagined my life would take this particular turn, when I woke that first frightening morning, to a guard, pulling me from the laundry room." "Nor did I imagine mine would," Draven admitted, "though I find myself remarkably grateful for how it unfolded, difficult as those weeks proved to be." Lord Edric approached them then, bowing formally before Elira, in a manner that carried genuine humility, rather than his earlier desperate scheming. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing her properly for the first time, "I owe you an apology, far greater than words can adequately convey. I allowed fear and ambition to blind me to the harm my choices caused, and I am grateful this kingdom found its way through that harm, to something far better than what I nearly helped destroy." "The past cannot be undone, Lord Edric," Elira said, extending a measure of grace she had not expected to feel toward him after everything that had transpired. "But it can be learned from. I trust you intend to serve this council with more caution in the future." "I do," Edric said solemnly, before retreating to allow other well-wishers their turn to offer congratulations. As the celebration continued long into the evening, Elira found herself reflecting on the strange, winding path that had carried her from an overlooked maid scrubbing palace floors to a queen standing beside a king who had chosen truth over deception, courage over convenience, and genuine partnership over the political convenience an arranged binding might have offered instead. Lord Ashworth's scheme had sought to install a powerless, controlled figure upon the throne, believing fear and manipulation could shape a queen entirely to his ambitions. Instead, his conspiracy had inadvertently revealed something he never anticipated: a maid, whose courage and sharp mind proved far stronger than any manipulation he attempted to impose upon her, and a king, whose refusal to accept a lie ultimately led him toward a truth more valuable than any political alliance he might otherwise have secured. The court that had once dismissed Alira as invisible now stood united in acknowledging what its king had recognized from the very first moment he looked into her eyes and saw not a substitute, but someone entirely her own person, worthy of the throne she had never sought, yet had ultimately earned through every trial this conspiracy had thrown against her. As the night deepened and the celebration finally began winding toward its natural close, Draven drew Alira gently aside, away from the lingering crowd, his expression carrying the same quiet warmth that had grown between them throughout their shared ordeal. "Welcome home," he said softly, "not as a substitute, and not as a maid forced into circumstances beyond her control, but as exactly who you have always been, finally recognized by the kingdom that once overlooked you entirely." Alira smiled, feeling the weight of every difficult week settle finally into something resembling peace. "Thank you," she said, "for refusing to accept a lie, even when accepting it would have been far simpler for everyone involved." "I would refuse it again, 1,000 times over," Draven said, "if it meant finding my way back to you." Outside the palace windows, the stars had fully emerged over the quiet gardens, where so much of their story had unfolded, and Alira, standing beside the king who had chosen her freely, rather than accepting the lie forced upon them both, finally allowed herself to believe that whatever challenges the future might bring, she would face them, not as an invisible maid overlooked by the world around her, but as a queen who had earned her place through truth, courage, and a refusal to let fear silence what needed to be said. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, Alira settled slowly into her new position, learning the intricacies of council meetings and royal correspondence, with the same careful attention she had once given to the palace's dusty corners and overlooked hallways. She found, to her quiet satisfaction, that her years spent unnoticed among the servants had taught her to read people and situations with an instinct many lifelong nobles never developed, a skill that served her well as she took her place beside Draven in matters of governance. Lady Priscilla wrote often from her family's estate, her letters carrying a warmth and humor that suggested she had found genuine peace after her ordeal, along with a growing independence that seemed to bring her more contentment than the arranged binding she had once been destined for. She visited the palace twice in the following months, and each time, she and Alira spent long afternoons in the garden courtyard, discussing everything from council politics to matters entirely unrelated to the conspiracy that had first brought them together. Lord Ashworth remained confined within a distant fortress reserved for those who had betrayed the crown, his once considerable influence reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale, whispered among nobles wary of allowing ambition to outweigh conscience. Lord Edric, true to his word, served the council with renewed diligence and humility, eventually earning back a measure of the trust he had so thoroughly damaged through his initial complicity in Ashworth's scheme. On quiet evenings, when the demands of governance finally eased enough to allow rest, Alira and Draven often found themselves returning to the same garden courtyard, where so much of their story had unfolded, the place where fear had slowly given way to trust, and trust had eventually blossomed into something neither of them had expected to find within the frightening circumstances that first brought them together. "Do you ever think of that first morning?" Alira asked one such evening, watching the last light of day fade behind the palace towers, when a guard pulled me from the laundry room without explanation. "Often," Draven admitted. "I think of how easily that morning might have unfolded differently, had you chosen silence over truth in that hall." "I do not think I could have chosen silence," Alira said, "even if I had understood everything that would follow from speaking the truth instead." "I am endlessly grateful you did not," Draven said, drawing her hand gently into his own. "This kingdom owes its stability to that choice, and I owe you a debt I do not believe I could ever fully repay." "You have already repaid it," Alira said softly, "by refusing to accept the lie that first brought us together, and by choosing, freely and completely, the truth that followed." As the stars emerged fully over the palace gardens once more, Illyra allowed herself a final, quiet moment of reflection on everything the past months had brought her. From the terrifying uncertainty of that first morning, to the steady, hard-won peace she now carried as queen, beside a king who had proven, time and again, that character mattered more than circumstance, and that truth, however difficult to uncover, was always worth the courage it demanded to speak.